Millionaire CEO bets 10 million that he can win over the black waitress. What she did made him fall in love forever, forget the bet, and start thinking about having children with her. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. The summer air hung thick and humid over the bustling streets of Chicago as Alexander Montgomery strode confidently through the revolving doors of the Elite, the city's most exclusive restaurant. At 42, Alexander was the epitome of success, CEO of Montgomery Industries, a multi-billion-dollar tech empire that he had built from the ground up. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit his athletic frame perfectly, and his Rolex Daytona glinted under the restaurant's crystal chandeliers as he checked the time. He was 15 minutes early, just as he planned. "Mr. Montgomery, always a pleasure," greeted Dimitri, the maitre d', with a slight bow. "Your usual table is ready." Alexander nodded, his steel blue eyes surveying the room with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to assessing everything and everyone around him. "Thank you, Dimitri. I'm expecting company tonight, 7 gentlemen. We'll need privacy." "Of course, sir. Right this way." Alexander followed Dimitri to a secluded section at the back of the restaurant, where a round table was impeccably set. The private area was partially enclosed by ornate wooden panels, offering both exclusivity and a view of the main dining room, perfect for what he had planned tonight. As he took his seat, Alexander's gaze drifted to a waitress serving a nearby table. Something about her immediately caught his attention. Unlike the other servers who seemed to fade into the background with practiced invisibility, she had a presence that commanded notice. Her movements were graceful, yet efficient, and when she smiled at her customers, it seemed genuine rather than the rehearsed expression most servers wore. She was beautiful, with deep brown skin that glowed under the soft lighting and natural hair styled in an elegant updo. But it wasn't just her beauty that held his attention, it was the quiet confidence in her demeanor, the way she carried herself with dignity despite the occasional condescending tone from a patron. "Would you like something while you wait, sir?" Dimitri asked, breaking Alexander's concentration. "Just water for now," he replied, his eyes still fixed on the waitress. As Dimitri left, Alexander pulled out his phone to check his emails but found himself glancing up every few moments to watch the woman. There was something refreshingly authentic about her, a stark contrast to the polished artificiality of his usual social circle. It wasn't long before his guests began to arrive. One by one they filtered in, fellow CEOs, venture capitalists, and trust fund heirs, men who, like Alexander, had more money than they knew what to do with. Their handshakes were firm, their laughter loud, their confidence bordering on arrogance. "Montgomery, you old dog," boomed Victor Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Securities and Alexander's oldest friend, if one could call their competitive relationship friendship. "Still working on a Friday night? Don't you ever take that silver spoon out of your mouth to have some fun?" Alexander offered a practiced smile. "The silver spoon pays for your entertainment, Victor. Don't forget that." The men laughed, settling into their seats as waiters appeared with bottles of vintage scotch and wine. Their conversation flowed easily from business deals to politics to their latest acquisitions: yachts, vacation homes, women. Alexander participated in the conversation mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He kept finding his attention drawn to the waitress, who was now serving a table on the other side of the restaurant. He watched as she deftly handled a customer's complaint, maintaining her composure even as the man grew increasingly agitated. "Earth to Alex," Victor waved a hand in front of his face. "What's got you so distracted? Or should I say who?" He followed Alexander's gaze, a sly smile spreading across his face when he spotted the waitress. "Ah, I see. Not your usual type, though, is she?" The table fell silent, the men exchanging knowing looks. Alexander was notorious for dating models and socialites, tall, blonde, and predictably beautiful women who enhanced his image as much as his art collection did. I'm just impressed by her professionalism, Alexander replied coolly. Something you wouldn't recognize, Victor. More laughter, but Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. He never did like being the butt of a joke. Well, why don't you put your money where your mouth is then? What are you suggesting? Alexander asked, though he already knew where this was heading. This was how it always went with them. Everything turned into a competition, a bet, a chance to prove superiority. Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. 10 million says you can't get her to fall for you. The real deal, not just into your bed. The table erupted in whispers and chuckles. 10 million was pocket change to them, but the challenge, that was worth something. Alexander should have been offended by the suggestion. It was demeaning, treating a person like a prize to be won in their wealthy boys' game. But his competitive nature, the same drive that had propelled him to the top of the business world, flared up. That's absurd, Victor, he said, swirling the scotch in his glass. Is it? Or are you just worried you can't close the deal? Victor pressed, knowing exactly how to push Alexander's buttons. She's not the kind of woman who'd be impressed by your bank account. You'd have to actually be genuine. He said the last word like it was foreign, drawing out more laughter from the table. Alexander's jaw tightened. He glanced over at the waitress again. She was now talking to another server, her face lit up with laughter. He felt a twist of guilt at the idea of making her the subject of a bet, but his pride wouldn't let him back down from Victor's challenge. Fine, he said after a moment. 10 million. But there need to be rules. The men leaned in eagerly as Victor grinned. Of course. Rule number 1. You can't tell her about the bet. Rule number 2. You can't just shower her with money and luxury to win her over. Rule number 3. You have 6 months. And rule number 4. We need proof she's genuinely fallen for you, not just playing along. And how exactly do you propose we verify that? Alexander asked, already regretting engaging in this. She has to say she loves you without prompting, one of the others suggested. And mean it. And how would we know if she means it? Another countered. We'll know, Victor said confidently. Women in love have a certain look about them. Plus, we'll have her background thoroughly checked. If she's conning you, we'll find out. Alexander nodded slowly, his competitive side fully engaged now despite his better judgment. And what's to stop her from finding out about the bet? We'll all sign NDAs, Victor suggested. Make it legally binding. No one breathes a word of this to anyone. The waitress was now approaching their section, filling water glasses at a nearby table. Alexander caught a glimpse of her name tag, Zora. Gentlemen, I believe we have our waitress for the evening, Victor announced, gesturing subtly toward her. As if on cue, the restaurant manager approached their table, a tall man with a receding hairline and perpetual frown. Mr. Montgomery, gentlemen, I apologize, but we're short-staffed tonight. I've assigned Zora Johnson to your table. She's one of our best, I assure you. Alexander felt a jolt at hearing her name confirmed. Zora Johnson. It suited her. That will be fine, he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. The manager nodded and left, and moments later, Zora approached their table. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were a deep amber, intelligent and wary as they scanned the table of obviously wealthy men. Good evening, gentlemen, she said, her voice smooth and professional. My name is Zora, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some appetizers? The men ordered lavishly, showing off their knowledge of fine dining and expensive wines. Alexander remained quiet, observing Zora's reactions. She was unfazed by their obvious displays of wealth, maintaining her professional demeanor despite Victor's thinly veiled, flirtatious comments. When it was Alexander's turn to order, their eyes met briefly. He felt an unexpected flutter in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. It unsettled him. I'll have the seared scallops and the filet medium rare, he said, his voice softer than usual. Excellent choice, sir, Zora replied with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She collected the menus and left to place their orders. Well, Alex, looks like the game is on, Victor said, raising his glass in a toast. May the best man win, though we all know that's me. The others laughed, but Alexander barely heard them. He was already wondering how he'd approach Zora, how he'd get to know her beyond this restaurant setting. The bet had given him an excuse to pursue his interest, but now that it was official, he felt a twinge of guilt. She deserved better than to be the unwitting subject of a wager. Throughout the meal, Alexander found himself paying close attention to Zora's every movement, every word. He noticed how she remembered each person's order without writing it down, how she anticipated their needs before they voiced them, how she subtly steered Victor away from ordering a dish he was allergic to based on his other selections. She was smart, observant, and completely unimpressed by their wealth and status. When one of the men mentioned his recent purchase of a small island, she didn't bat an eye. As the evening progressed, Alexander's initial guilt began to transform into genuine curiosity. Who was Zora Johnson? What was her story? How had she developed such poise and intelligence while working as a waitress? He found himself wanting to know more about her, bet or no bet. When the bill came, Alexander insisted on paying for everyone as usual. He added a tip that was generous but not ostentatious. Somehow he knew that throwing money around would only alienate Zora rather than impress her. As the group prepared to leave, Alexander lingered behind, watching as Zora efficiently cleared their table. "Thank you for your excellent service tonight," he said when she glanced up and noticed him still standing there. "Just doing my job, sir," she replied, her tone polite but distant. Alexander hesitated, then drew a business card from his wallet. "I'm Alexander Montgomery," he said, offering the card. "If you ever need anything, or perhaps would like to discuss job opportunities at my company, please don't hesitate to call." Zora looked at the card but didn't take it. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Montgomery, but I'm quite content with my current situation." Alexander was taken aback. People didn't usually refuse his offers, especially not waitresses being handed a potential opportunity by a billionaire CEO. "It's just a card," he said, trying to keep the surprise from his voice. "No obligations." Zora studied him for a moment, her amber eyes seeming to see right through his facade. Then, with a small sigh, she accepted the card and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Have a good evening, Mr. Montgomery," she said, turning back to her work. Alexander stood there for a moment longer, oddly flustered by the interaction. Then, nodding to himself, he turned and joined his friends who were waiting by the entrance. "Phase 1 complete?" Victor asked with a smirk. "Hardly," Alexander replied, "but I'm just getting started." As they stepped out into the warm Chicago night, Alexander found himself already planning his next move. The bet had receded to the back of his mind, overshadowed by a genuine desire to learn more about the intriguing waitress who had so easily dismissed his status and wealth. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Zora Johnson was far more than she appeared. Behind her calm demeanor and service industry smile lay a sharp mind, a complicated past, and a journey that had made her immune to the superficial charms of men like Alexander Montgomery. If he was going to win her heart, he would need to become something he hadn't been in a very long time: real. The game had indeed begun, but it wouldn't play out the way any of them expected, least of all Alexander himself. 3 days later, Alexander found himself sitting in his expansive corner office, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he'd conquered, but today, he barely noticed it. His mind was occupied with thoughts of Zora Johnson. His executive assistant, Marissa, entered with his afternoon coffee. "Sir, your 3 o'clock with the board has been pushed to 4 and Mr. Blackwell called. Again." Alexander nodded absently. "Thank you, Marissa. Did you find anything?" Marissa placed a thin folder on his desk. "Everything we could find on Zora Johnson as requested. It's Less than I expected. That caught Alexander's attention. In his experience, everyone had a digital footprint, especially in this age. His team could usually compile comprehensive dossiers on anyone within hours. "What do you mean?" he asked, reaching for the folder. "She's practically a ghost, sir. Minimal social media presence. Just a private Instagram account with very few posts. No LinkedIn, no Twitter. She pays her taxes, has no criminal record, and has worked at the Elite for 3 years. Before that, she worked at another restaurant called Harvest Moon for 2 years. She rents an apartment in Bronzeville, drives a 10-year-old Honda, and volunteers at a community center teaching adult literacy classes on weekends." Alexander flipped through the sparse pages. Education? Bachelor's degree in English literature from Howard University, graduated with honors 8 years ago. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Howard? That's a prestigious school." "Yes, sir. She had a full academic scholarship." He continued scanning the limited information. No debt, no extravagant purchases, no obvious vices or vulnerabilities. Zora Johnson lived a simple, contained life that left remarkably few traces. What about family? Relationships? Parents deceased? No siblings that we could find? No romantic partner on record, though that doesn't mean there isn't one. Alexander frowned, closing the folder. This wasn't nearly enough. He needed more if he was going to find a way to connect with her. "Keep digging," he instructed. "There has to be more." Marissa hesitated, which was unusual for her. "Sir, if I may, this is a bit more thorough than your usual background checks on potential dates." Alexander shot her a sharp look. "It's just business, Marissa. Potential investment in the restaurant industry." She didn't look convinced, but knew better than to press further. "Of course, sir. Will there be anything else?" "Yes. Make a reservation at the Elite for dinner tonight, just for one." After Marissa left, Alexander swiveled his chair to face the windows again. He couldn't explain, even to himself, why he was so intrigued by this waitress. Perhaps it was simply the challenge she presented. Someone who didn't immediately fall at his feet, impressed by his wealth and power. Or perhaps it was something more, something about the quiet dignity she carried. Either way, he had a bet to win. And Alexander Montgomery never lost. That evening, Alexander arrived at the Elite at precisely 7 o'clock. He'd chosen to dress down slightly, opting for dark jeans and a cashmere sweater rather than his usual suit. The hostess led him to a small table for 2 near the bar. Not his usual spot, but perfect for what he had in mind. "Is Zora working tonight?" he asked casually. The hostess nodded. "Yes, sir, but she's covering the private dining rooms this evening." Alexander feigned disappointment. "Ah, that's a shame. She provided excellent service when I was here with colleagues earlier this week. I can request her specifically for your table, Mr. Montgomery," the hostess offered eagerly. No, he replied, waving a dismissive hand. "I wouldn't want to disrupt your staffing arrangements. Whoever you've assigned will be fine." He settled in, ordering a Macallan 25 and perusing the menu while discreetly scanning the restaurant for Zora. He spotted her eventually, emerging from one of the private dining rooms with an empty tray. She moved with the same grace he'd noticed before, her face composed and professional. Alexander took his time with dinner, ordering multiple courses and lingering over dessert and coffee. He kept an eye on the time, noting when servers began their end-of-shift duties. Finally, around 10:30, he paid his bill and walked out into the mild evening air. Instead of having his driver pick him up immediately, he instructed him to wait around the corner. Then, Alexander positioned himself near the employee exit, checking emails on his phone as though waiting for someone. At 11:15, the door opened and servers began filing out. Some headed for the nearby L station, others toward the parking lot. Alexander kept his head down, feigning absorption in his device. Finally, Zora emerged. She had changed out of her uniform into jeans and a simple blouse, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Her hair was now down, falling in natural coils around her face. She looked tired but somehow still radiant. Alexander waited until she was a few steps past him before looking up and affecting surprise. "Zora? From the elite, right?" She turned, wariness immediately replacing fatigue on her face when she recognized him. "Mr. Montgomery, can I help you with something?" "I was just waiting for a colleague," he lied smoothly. "We're heading to a late meeting. Completely lost track of you working there. Small world." Her expression made it clear she didn't believe him for a second. "Indeed. Well, have a good evening." She turned to leave, but Alexander stepped forward. "Actually, since we've run into each other, I was wondering if I could talk to you about something, a business proposition." Zora paused, eyeing him skeptically. "Mr. Montgomery, it's late and I've just finished a long shift." "It would only take a few minutes," he pressed. "I'm considering investing in a new restaurant concept, and I'd value input from someone with your experience in the industry." She seemed to waver, curiosity briefly flashing across her features. "Why me? Surely you know dozens of restaurateurs and chefs." "They all tell me what they think I want to hear," Alexander replied honestly. "I need someone who will be straight with me. You strike me as that kind of person." Zora checked her watch, then glanced down the street toward the bus stop where other restaurant workers were gathering. "I have 20 minutes before my bus." "There's a coffee shop around the corner," Alexander suggested. "My treat." She hesitated again, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but just coffee." The late-night cafe was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered among the tables. Alexander ordered an espresso for himself and looked to Zora expectantly. "Chamomile tea, please," she told the barista. When Alexander reached for his wallet, she quickly added, "I'll pay for my own, thank you." It was a small thing, but it caught him off guard. Women never refused when he offered to pay. "Please, I insist," he said. "And I insist otherwise," she replied firmly. "You said you wanted honest input. Consider this part of that." Alexander withdrew his hand, intrigued once again by her resistance to his usual charm. They took their drinks to a corner table, and Zora immediately cut to the chase. "What's this restaurant concept you're supposedly investing in?" The supposedly didn't escape his notice. She was sharp. "Farm to table, focused on sustainable practices and locally sourced ingredients," he improvised, drawing on a recent pitch he'd received. "Casual fine dining, accessible price points." Zora's expression remained neutral as she sipped her tea. "And what do you want to know? Would you dine there? As a consumer, not a restaurant employee?" She considered the question seriously. "Depends. Farm to table and sustainable are buzzwords now. Every restaurant claims to be those things. What would make yours different? And who's your target demographic? If you're trying to make fine dining accessible, are you genuinely interested in serving communities that typically can't afford such experiences? Or is it just marketing speak for slightly less expensive than the elite?" Alexander blinked, taken aback by her incisive questions. Most people were too intimidated by his status to challenge him so directly. "Those are excellent points," he acknowledged. "What if the restaurant partnered with community organizations to offer culinary training to residents from underserved neighborhoods? And perhaps implemented a program where for every meal purchased, one is donated to a food-insecure family?" Zora's expression softened slightly. "That would be a start, but it needs to be genuine, not just a PR move, and the staff should reflect the community it serves, with fair wages and advancement opportunities." "You've given this some thought," Alexander observed. She shrugged. "I've been in the industry long enough to see how these places operate. The pretty mission statements versus the reality. Have you ever considered opening your own restaurant?" he asked, genuinely curious now. A fleeting shadow passed over her face. "Once. It's a brutal industry with slim margins and high failure rates. Not everyone has millions to gamble with." There was a bite to her words that hinted at personal experience. Alexander made a mental note to have Marissa dig deeper into Zora's past. "What if you did have the capital?" he pressed. "What kind of place would you create?" For a moment, Something like passion flashed in Zora's eyes. A community space as much as a restaurant. Good, honest food that honors diverse culinary traditions. A place where people from all walks of life could afford to eat well and be treated with respect. Cooking classes for kids, job training. She caught herself and stopped abruptly. But that's not reality. Alexander leaned forward, genuinely interested. It could be. With the right investor? Zora's guard came back up immediately. Mr. Montgomery, is this why you happened to be outside my workplace tonight? To dangle investment opportunities? Call me Alexander, he said, avoiding her question, and I'm simply exploring possibilities. Your insights are valuable. She checked her watch and stood. My bus will be here in 5 minutes. I need to go. Alexander rose as well. At least let me drive you home. It's late and… No, she cut him off firmly. Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Montgomery, but I'm perfectly capable of getting myself home safely, as I do every night. Then perhaps we could continue this discussion another time, he suggested. Over dinner, maybe? Zora paused, studying him with those perceptive amber eyes. Why are you really interested in talking to me, Mr. Montgomery? A waitress you met once? Alexander met her gaze steadily. Because you're different. You don't pretend or posture. That's rare in my world. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, perhaps even a hint of genuine emotion, but it quickly disappeared behind her composed exterior. Good night, Mr. Montgomery, she said, and walked out of the cafe. Alexander watched her go, aware that he'd made minimal progress. Zora Johnson was proving to be more challenging than he'd anticipated. But rather than frustrating him, it only intensified his interest. Back in his penthouse later that night, Alexander poured himself a nightcap and stood on his balcony overlooking the glittering city. Somewhere out there, Zora was returning to her modest apartment, living a life completely disconnected from his world of wealth and privilege. His phone buzzed with a text from Victor. Progress report on our little wager, or ready to admit defeat already? Alexander ignored it. This wasn't just about the bet anymore. Zora had sparked his genuine curiosity, and he wasn't about to give Victor the satisfaction of detailed updates. Besides, he'd learned something valuable tonight. Underneath Zora's cool exterior lay passion and dreams she kept carefully guarded. That was his way in. Everyone had something they wanted, something they needed. He just had to figure out what would genuinely matter to someone who seemed immune to the usual trappings of wealth. As he sipped his whiskey, Alexander began formulating a new approach. He wouldn't win Zora over with money or status. He would need to offer something more meaningful, perhaps the chance to realize the vision she'd briefly revealed. It was manipulation, yes. But if it resulted in her dream becoming reality, would that be so wrong? The question lingered uncomfortably as Alexander finished his drink and prepared for bed, already planning his next move in a game that was becoming increasingly complex. The Adult Literacy Center was housed in a weathered brick building in Bronzeville, its faded sign barely visible from the street. Alexander sat in his Bentley across the road, feeling oddly nervous. This was far from his usual territory, both geographically and situationally. The South Side neighborhood, while undergoing some revitalization, was still predominantly working class and a world away from the gleaming skyscrapers and luxury condos of his daily life. "Sir, are you sure you want me to leave you here?" his driver, James, asked, with poorly concealed concern. Alexander nodded, checking his watch. "Yes, I'll call when I need you." He'd dressed down significantly for this excursion. Jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low. The last thing he needed was to be recognized. After weeks of careful planning and discreet inquiries, he'd finally found the perfect pretext to see Zora again, in an environment where she might be more receptive. Stepping out of the car, Alexander felt conspicuous despite his casual attire. James drove away reluctantly, and Alexander crossed the street, rehearsing his story one last time. Inside the center, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a neat bun sat at a reception desk. She looked up, surprised to see an unfamiliar face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone friendly but curious. "Yes, I'm here about the literacy program," Alexander replied, offering his most charming smile. "I'd like to volunteer." The woman's face brightened. "That's wonderful. We're always in need of tutors. I'm Mrs. Washington, the center director. And you are?" "Alex Morgan," he said, using the alias he'd prepared. "I recently moved to the area and was looking for ways to give back to the community." "Well, Alex, you've come to the right place. We have adult reading classes on Monday and Wednesday evenings and a Saturday morning program as well. Do you have any teaching experience?" "Some informal mentoring," he answered vaguely. "I enjoy helping others develop their skills." Mrs. Washington beamed. "Perfect. As it happens, one of our Saturday tutors is here now with a session. Would you like to observe? It might give you a better idea of what we do." "That would be great," Alexander agreed, his pulse quickening. According to his intelligence, Zora should be teaching right now. Mrs. Washington led him down a hallway lined with children's artwork and motivational posters. She stopped at a classroom door and knocked gently before opening it. "Sorry to interrupt, Zora, but I have a potential new volunteer who'd like to observe, if that's all right?" Alexander got his first glimpse of Zora in her element. She stood beside a whiteboard, dressed in jeans and a simple yellow blouse that brightened her complexion. Around a large table sat 5 adults of varying ages, each with books and notebooks open before them. Zora's face registered immediate recognition when she saw Alexander, followed by suspicion and something like resignation. But her voice betrayed none of this when she spoke. "Of course, Mrs. Washington. We're just discussing character development in short stories." Mrs. Washington ushered Alexander in. "Everyone, this is Alex Morgan. He's interested in joining our volunteer team." The students greeted him warmly and Mrs. Washington retreated, leaving Alexander standing awkwardly near the door. Zora gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us," she said, her tone professional. "We were just about to have Darnell read a passage from his original story." Alexander took the seat, grateful for the reprieve from Zora's scrutiny. A middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair began reading haltingly from a composition notebook. His story about a grandfather teaching his grandson to fish was simple but touching. When he finished, the group offered encouraging feedback, with Zora guiding the discussion with gentle expertise. "What did you think, Mr. Morgan?" Zora asked, finally addressing him directly. Alexander, who had been genuinely moved by the story, responded honestly. "I thought it was beautiful. The relationship between the characters felt very authentic." Darnell beamed with pride, and Alexander found himself smiling back, unexpectedly affected by the man's joy at having his work appreciated. The session continued for another 45 minutes, during which Alexander observed Zora's teaching style. She was patient but firm, encouraging but not patronizing. Her students clearly respected her, and she treated each of them with genuine dignity. It was a side of her he hadn't seen at the restaurant, where her warmth was tempered by professional reserve. When the class ended, the students gathered their materials and filed out, each thanking Zora and nodding politely to Alexander. Once they were alone, Zora's demeanor shifted, her warmth cooling considerably. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, crossing her arms. "Or is it Morgan now? Are you following me?" Alexander had anticipated this reaction. "I prefer Alex, actually. And yes, I sought you out, but not for the reasons you might think." "Enlighten me," she replied, her tone making it clear she was not in a trusting mood. "I was impressed by our conversation about community investment," he said, sticking to his prepared explanation. "I wanted to see firsthand the kind of work you're involved in." "So you created a false identity and invaded my volunteer space?" Her amber eyes flashed with indignation. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate that is?" Alexander had the grace to look slightly abashed. I apologize for the subterfuge. I was concerned that if I approached you directly, you'd refuse to speak with me again. With good reason, apparently, she countered, gathering her teaching materials with sharp, angry movements. What is this really about, Mr. Montgomery? Because I'm having trouble believing that a billionaire CEO is suddenly interested in adult literacy in Bronzeville. I'm interested in people who are passionate about making a difference, he replied, the words coming out more sincerely than he'd intended. When we spoke about your restaurant concept, I saw that passion in you. I wanted to understand it better. Zora paused, studying him with those perceptive eyes. So this is still about the restaurant idea? Partly, Alexander admitted. I think your concept has real potential. But I also wanted to see this side of your life, to understand what drives you. Why? She asked bluntly. We're strangers, Mr. Montgomery. I'm a waitress you met once and apparently decided to investigate. Normal people don't do that. Alexander knew he was treading dangerous ground. The truth about the bet, about his initial motivations, would destroy any chance of gaining her trust, but he also sensed that more lies would only push her further away. You're right, he conceded. My behavior has been unconventional. The truth is, I'm surrounded by people who only see my wealth and power. You saw me, just me, and weren't impressed. It was refreshing. A hint of surprise flickered across Zora's face, but she quickly masked it. So this is what? A billionaire's midlife crisis? Slumming it with the common folk to feel something real? Her words stung more than Alexander expected. That's not fair. Isn't it? She challenged. You invaded my workplace, stalked me to my volunteer position, and created a fake identity. How would you react if someone did that to you? She had a point, and Alexander knew it. You're right. I apologize. My approach was misguided. Zora sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Look, Mr. Montgomery. Alex, he interrupted. Please. Alex, she conceded reluctantly. I don't know what you want from me, but I have a full life with real responsibilities. I don't have time for whatever game this is. It's not a game, Alexander said, the irony of his statement not lost on him. I genuinely think your restaurant concept could work, and I'm in a position to help make it happen. No strings attached. Zora looked skeptical. People like you always have strings attached. Give me a chance to prove otherwise, he pressed. Let me take you to dinner, as colleagues discussing a business opportunity. She hesitated, clearly torn. I don't think that's a good idea. One dinner, Alexander insisted, in a public place of your choosing. If you're still not interested after that, I'll respectfully bow out and leave you alone. Zora considered this for a long moment. Why are you so persistent about this? It was a fair question, and one Alexander wasn't entirely sure he could answer honestly, even to himself. The bet with Victor felt increasingly distant and unimportant. There was something about Zora, her integrity, her passion, her complete disinterest in his wealth, that had captured his attention in a way no woman had in years. Because I think we could create something meaningful together, he finally said. A restaurant that embodies the values you described: community, accessibility, respect, and selfishly, I'd like to get to know the person who can command a room full of adults learning to read with such natural authority. A ghost of a smile touched Zora's lips. That was almost smooth. I have my moments, Alexander replied, feeling an unexpected flutter at having made her almost smile. Zora checked her watch. I have another commitment now. I need to go. Of course, Alexander said, trying to hide his disappointment. But about dinner? She sighed. One dinner. As potential business associates, next Friday at Harvest Moon, 7 p.m. It's in Hyde Park. Alexander recognized the name, the restaurant where she'd worked before the elite, according to Marissa's report. I'll be there. As they walked out together, Alexander noticed Zora check her phone and frown. Is everything all right? He asked. My ride canceled, she muttered, scrolling through her contacts. "I'd be happy to drive you," Alexander offered immediately. "No, thank you," Zora replied, still focused on her phone. "I'll just order a rideshare." Alexander glanced out the window to see rain beginning to fall heavily. "It might be a long wait in this weather. Please, let me help. No ulterior motives." Zora looked up at the downpour, then back at Alexander, clearly calculating her options. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but I'm directing you to a public location, not my home." "Of course," Alexander agreed, pulling out his phone to summon James. "Whatever makes you comfortable." They waited under the awning until the Bentley appeared. James exited with an umbrella, looking confused at the unfamiliar location but maintaining his professional demeanor. "Thank you, James," Alexander said. "We'll be giving Ms. Johnson a ride." Zora's eyebrows rose slightly at the luxury vehicle and chauffeur, but she said nothing as James held the umbrella over her to the car door. Once they were settled in the back seat, Zora gave James an address for a coffee shop about 10 blocks away. "I can walk to my next engagement from there," she explained to Alexander, making it clear she still wasn't comfortable sharing too much personal information. "Of course," he replied, "and thank you for agreeing to dinner next Friday." Zora turned to look out the window at the rain-slicked streets. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Montgomery. I'm still not entirely convinced this isn't some elaborate prank or midlife crisis." Alexander smiled at her bluntness. "Neither am I, to be honest." This drew a surprised glance from Zora, and for a brief moment their eyes met in genuine amusement. It was a small connection, but it felt like progress. As the Bentley glided through the rainy streets of Chicago's South Side, Alexander found himself looking forward to Friday with an eagerness that had nothing to do with Victor's wager. He was genuinely curious about Zora Johnson, about the life she'd built, and the values she clearly held dear. The bet had brought them together, but something else entirely was keeping him interested. Whether that something would lead to genuine feelings, the kind required to win the wager, remained to be seen. But for now, Alexander was content to have secured a dinner date, even if Zora insisted on viewing it strictly as a business meeting. James caught his eye in the rearview mirror, a question in his expression. Alexander gave a small shake of his head. This wasn't the time or place for explanations. Besides, he wasn't sure he could explain his interest in Zora, even to himself. All he knew was that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was intrigued by a woman for reasons that had nothing to do with physical attraction or social advantage. Zora Johnson represented something different, something real in his world of carefully curated appearances, and that perhaps was worth more than $10 million. Harvest Moon was nothing like the elite. Located in a converted Victorian house in Hyde Park, it exuded a warm, homey atmosphere with its mismatched vintage furniture, local artwork adorning the walls, and soft jazz playing in the background. The tables were spaced far enough apart for privacy, but the overall vibe encouraged community rather than exclusivity. Alexander arrived 15 minutes early, having researched the restaurant thoroughly. It was a neighborhood gem, family-owned for 3 generations, serving elevated comfort food with global influences. The online reviews raved about both the food and the inclusive atmosphere, where university professors dined alongside local families and students. He'd again dressed more casually than usual. Dark jeans, a navy blazer over a light blue shirt, no tie. Still, he felt conspicuously out of place among the diverse, relaxed clientele. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" asked a friendly hostess who couldn't have been more than 20. "Yes, Montgomery, table for 2, he replied, scanning the room for Zora. "Of course. Your companion hasn't arrived yet. Would you like to be seated or wait at the bar?" "The table, please." The hostess led him to a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the open kitchen. As he settled in, a server approached with water and menus. "Welcome to Harvest Moon," she said warmly. "My name is Jade, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I get you something to drink while you wait? Alexander ordered a local craft beer, something he rarely drank but felt appropriate for the setting. As Jade walked away, he noticed several staff members glancing his way with barely concealed curiosity. Clearly, someone had recognized him. 7 o'clock came and went. By 7:15, Alexander was beginning to wonder if Zora had changed her mind. Just as he was about to check his phone, the door opened and she walked in. She looked different outside of work. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore a simple burgundy dress that flattered her athletic figure. Several staff members greeted her enthusiastically as she made her way to the table, confirming Alexander's suspicion that this place held special meaning for her. "Sorry I'm late," she said, slipping into the seat across from him. "The L was delayed." "No problem," Alexander replied, standing briefly as she sat. "I was enjoying the atmosphere. This place is lovely." "It is," Zora agreed, her expression softening as she looked around. "It's special to me." Before Alexander could inquire further, Jade returned with his beer and a warm smile for Zora. "Miss Johnson, it's so good to see you." "You too, Jade. How's school going?" "Just finished my first year at U of C. Your advice about the scholarship applications changed everything." Zora beamed. "I knew you could do it. Is Mama Esther in tonight?" "In the kitchen, as always. She'll want to see you before you leave." Zora turned to Alexander. "Mama Esther is the owner. She basically adopted everyone who's ever worked here." After Zora ordered a glass of wine, Jade disappeared, leaving them alone. For a moment, an awkward silence hung between them, as if neither was quite sure how to proceed now that they were actually sitting across from each other by choice. "So," Alexander began, "you worked here before the elite?" Zora nodded. "For 2 years. Mama Esther taught me everything I know about the restaurant business. The real business, not just serving food." "What made you leave for the elite?" A shadow crossed Zora's face. "Better pay, better tips. After my mother got sick, I needed the money." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you," Zora replied, her tone making it clear she didn't want to elaborate. Jade returned with Zora's wine and to take their orders. Alexander deferred to Zora. "Whatever you recommend. I trust you know the best dishes." It was a small gesture of respect, but he noticed Zora's posture relax slightly in response. She ordered them a selection of dishes to share: cornbread with honey butter, blackened catfish with dirty rice, jerk chicken with sweet potato mash, and collard greens. "Soul food with Caribbean influences," she explained. "Mama Esther's family is from Jamaica originally, but she grew up in Chicago. The menu reflects that journey." "It sounds incredible," Alexander said sincerely. He dined at Michelin-starred restaurants around the world. But there was something appealing about the authenticity of this place. "Now," Zora said, getting down to business, "you wanted to discuss a restaurant concept." Alexander took a sip of his beer, organizing his thoughts. "Yes, after our conversation, I did some research. The model you described, a community-focused restaurant that serves diverse clientele while providing job training, it's not just idealistic. It can be profitable with the right approach." Zora raised an eyebrow. "You researched my offhand comments?" "I did," Alexander admitted. "There are successful examples in other cities. One in Detroit combines a high-end restaurant with a teaching kitchen for at-risk youth. Another in Oakland operates on a sliding-scale payment model without sacrificing quality." "Those are exceptional cases," Zora argued. "Most restaurants barely survive their first year, let alone manage to sustain community programs." "Most restaurants don't have proper capitalization or experienced management," Alexander countered. "With adequate funding and your expertise, it could work." Their food began arriving, momentarily pausing the conversation. The aromas were intoxicating: spices, herbs, and slow-cooked goodness that made Alexander's mouth water. He watched as Zora closed her eyes briefly while inhaling the fragrance of the dishes, a small smile playing on her lips. Try the cornbread first, she instructed, serving him a piece with a generous dollop of honey butter. Alexander took a bite and couldn't suppress a groan of appreciation. It was perfect, sweet but not cloying, with a texture that was somehow both light and substantial. "This is incredible," he said after swallowing. Zora's smile widened. "Wait until you try the catfish." For the next few minutes they ate in companionable silence, Alexander savoring each new flavor. The food was nothing like the precise artistic creations at the elite. It was soulful, hearty, and deeply satisfying in a way that spoke of tradition and care. "So," Zora said eventually, returning to their discussion, "you think my restaurant idea could work, and you're offering to finance it. Why?" Alexander considered his response carefully. The truth, that this had all started as a bet, was unthinkable. But he also felt a growing desire to be honest with her in other ways. "I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes," he began. "Traditionally, I've invested in tech startups, real estate, the usual channels. But lately I've been thinking about legacy. What am I actually contributing to the world?" Zora studied him over the rim of her wine glass. "And you think a community restaurant is your path to meaning?" There was skepticism in her voice, but not the biting sarcasm from before. She was actually listening. "I think partnering with someone who understands community needs, who has both vision and practical experience, could create something valuable," Alexander replied. "Something that makes a real difference in people's lives." "And I'm that person?" Zora asked, setting down her glass. "A waitress you barely know? A Howard University graduate with obvious intelligence and passion, who volunteers teaching literacy and has earned the respect of everyone in this restaurant," Alexander corrected. "Yes, I think you might be that person." Zora looked taken aback by his assessment, as if she wasn't used to being seen so comprehensively. "You've really done your homework." "I'm thorough," Alexander admitted. "It's part of what's made me successful." "And what would this partnership look like?" she asked, her professional curiosity clearly engaged despite her reservations. "Would I be an employee? A consultant?" "A true partner," Alexander clarified. "I provide the capital, you provide the expertise and vision. We'd share ownership 50-50. Zora's eyes widened in surprise. "That's unusually generous." "It's practical," Alexander countered. "For this to succeed, you'd need the authority and incentive to make it truly yours. I'd be a silent partner, financially speaking." "And what would you get out of it?" Zora pressed, still searching for the catch. Alexander considered this. The bet was still there, lurking in the background of his mind, but it felt increasingly irrelevant to what was happening between them. "The satisfaction of seeing a worthwhile concept succeed," he said, "and perhaps a connection to something real." The last part came out more vulnerably than he'd intended. Zora's expression softened slightly. "You keep saying that, something real. What does that mean to you?" It was a probing question, one that forced Alexander to examine feelings he usually ignored. "In my world," he began slowly, "everything is calculated. Relationships are strategic. Appearances matter more than substance. But here," he gestured around the restaurant, "people connect over food, over shared experiences. They're not performing or positioning. They're just being. And that appeals to you?" Zora asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Increasingly," Alexander admitted, "though I'm not sure I remember how to just be." A small, genuine smile touched Zora's lips. "That's surprisingly honest." Before Alexander could respond, a formidable woman in a chef's coat approached their table. She was in her 70s, with silver dreadlocks pulled back under a bandana, deep brown skin lined with age, and piercing eyes that assessed Alexander immediately. "So this is the mysterious dinner companion," she said, her voice rich with a slight Jamaican lilt. "Zora doesn't bring men here often." "Mama Esther," Zora said, standing to embrace the woman. "This is Alexander Montgomery. Alex, this is Esther Campbell, the heart and soul of Harvest Moon." Alexander stood and extended his hand, which Esther ignored in favor of pulling him into a firm hug. "Any friend of Zora's is family here," she declared, releasing him. "How's the food?" "Extraordinary," Alexander replied honestly. "Best meal I've had in months." Esther nodded approvingly. "Good taste in food, at least," she said to Zora with a meaningful look. "You two enjoy. Dessert's on the house tonight." After she departed, Alexander raised an eyebrow at Zora. "I get the feeling I just passed some kind of test." "Mama Esther is protective," Zora explained, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "And she knows I don't date much." "Is that what this is?" Alexander asked, seizing the opening. "A date?" Zora's guard came back up immediately. "This is a business discussion, as agreed." "Of course," Alexander backpedaled, not wanting to ruin the progress they'd made. "Though I must say it's the most enjoyable business meeting I've had in years." This earned him a small smile. "The food helps." "The company helps more," Alexander replied, the words coming naturally. For a moment, Zora's professional mask slipped, and Alexander caught a glimpse of vulnerability beneath. She quickly recovered, redirecting the conversation back to the restaurant concept. But something had shifted between them. By the time they finished the exceptional bread pudding Mama Esther sent out, they had outlined a rough framework for the potential restaurant: location possibilities, staffing structure, community programs. Zora's knowledge of the industry was impressive, and Alexander found himself genuinely excited about the possibility. "I should think about this," Zora said as they waited for the check, which Alexander insisted on paying despite her protests. "It's a big commitment." "Of course," Alexander agreed. "Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll consider it seriously." Outside the restaurant, the spring night was mild, stars obscured by the city lights. They stood awkwardly for a moment, the evening clearly drawing to a close. "I had a good time," Zora admitted, surprising them both, "despite my reservations." "High praise indeed," Alexander replied with a smile. "Does this mean I've earned the right to see you again?" Zora hesitated, then nodded slowly. "To continue discussing the restaurant?" "Yes." It wasn't quite what Alexander had hoped for, but it was progress. "I'll call you." "I don't recall giving you my number," Zora pointed out, a hint of amusement in her voice. Alexander grinned sheepishly. "Would you like to?" Zora held out her hand, and Alexander placed his phone in it. She entered her number, then handed it back. "Good night, Alex." "Good night, Zora," he replied, watching as she turned and walked toward the L station, her burgundy dress swaying gently in the evening breeze. Alexander could have offered her a ride, summoned James from wherever he was waiting nearby, but he understood that Zora needed to maintain her independence, her boundaries. This fragile connection they were building required respect for her terms. As he walked to where his driver was parked, Alexander realized he hadn't thought about Victor's bet once during their entire dinner. For a few hours, he'd simply been a man enjoying the company of a fascinating woman, discussing a project they both found meaningful. It had been perhaps the most authentic evening he'd spent in years. The realization both elated and terrified him. "You're distracted," Victor Blackwell observed, studying Alexander across the conference table. "Have been all meeting." The board meeting had just concluded, and the other members had filed out, leaving only the two men in the sleek, window-walled room overlooking the Chicago skyline. Alexander gathered his papers, avoiding Victor's scrutinizing gaze. "I was thinking about the Singapore expansion," he lied smoothly. "Lots of moving parts." Victor chuckled, the sound lacking any real warmth. "Bullshit. You've been checking your phone every 5 minutes. Is it our little waitress?" Alexander felt a flash of irritation at Victor's dismissive tone. "Her name is Zora." "Ooh, defensive?" Victor teased, leaning back in his chair. "So you're making progress. Good. For a while there, I thought I'd be 10 million richer by default." 3 weeks had passed since the dinner at Harvest Moon. In that time, Alexander and Zora had met twice more, once to visit potential restaurant locations and once for coffee to discuss business plans. Each meeting had been ostensibly professional, yet Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to Zora's intelligence, principles, and subtle humor. "The bet's still on," Alexander replied, keeping his voice neutral despite the discomfort he now felt about the whole arrangement. "But these things take time." Victor drummed his fingers on the polished mahogany table. "Time is money, my friend. And speaking of money, the boys are getting impatient for updates. They want proof you're not just stringing us along." "What kind of proof?" "A double date," Victor suggested with a predatory smile. "Bring her to Allium on Saturday. I'll bring Cassandra. We can see how she handles herself in our world." Alexander frowned. "She's not ready for that." "Not ready? Or are you afraid we'll scare her off?" Victor's eyes narrowed with sudden insight. "Or maybe you're afraid we'll tell her about the bet." "We all signed NDAs," Alexander reminded him, trying to keep the anxiety from his voice. "Relax, Alex. We're just curious about the woman who's got you so invested." Victor stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Saturday, 8 o'clock. Don't disappoint us." After Victor left, Alexander remained seated, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. He'd been carefully keeping his two worlds separate: the rarefied realm of wealth and power he inhabited, and the authentic, grounded world Zora represented. The idea of those worlds colliding filled him with apprehension. Moreover, he wasn't sure how to invite Zora without making it seem like he was pushing for a more romantic relationship. Their interactions had remained studiously professional despite the growing tension between them. Alexander suspected Zora was attracted to him, but was deliberately keeping her guard up. A barrier he respected, even as he longed to break through it. With a sigh, he pulled out his phone and sent her a text. "Need to discuss the investor presentation. Dinner this weekend?" Her response came faster than usual. "Can't do dinner. Community Center fundraiser Saturday night. You could join if you're interested. Black tie, $500 donation." Alexander stared at the message, surprised by the invitation. This was the first time Zora had initiated any meeting between them. The fundraiser would be a public event, safe territory for her, but still a step toward integrating him into her life. It also presented a perfect solution to Victor's demand. He could honestly say Zora had prior commitments while still spending time with her in a context she controlled. "I'd be honored," he texted back. "Send details." The Bronzeville Community Center fundraising gala was held in the restored ballroom of a historic hotel. Though modest compared to the charity events Alexander typically attended, the space was elegantly decorated with twinkling lights and floral arrangements. Alexander arrived alone, having donated $50,000 anonymously rather than the suggested $500. He chose a classic black tuxedo, deliberately avoiding the designer labels and custom details that would set him apart from the other attendees. Tonight wasn't about standing out. It was about fitting into Zora's world. The ballroom was already half full with a diverse crowd: community leaders, local business owners, educators, and residents. Alexander scanned the room for Zora but didn't see her. Instead, he was approached by Mrs. Washington from the Literacy Center. "Mr. Morgan, or should I say Mr. Montgomery?" she said with a knowing smile. "Zora told me who you really are." Alexander winced slightly. "I apologize for the deception, Mrs. Washington." She waved his apology away. "Zora explained about your restaurant partnership. I'm just glad she's finally pursuing that dream again." "Again?" Alexander asked, his interest piqued. Mrs. Washington's expression turned sympathetic. "Oh dear, has she not told you? I shouldn't say more. Zora's quite private about that chapter of her life." Before Alexander could press further, the crowd shifted, and he caught his first glimpse of Zora. She stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile. Her gown was a deep emerald that complemented her skin tone perfectly, elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo, accented with delicate crystal pins. She was breathtaking. "Go say hello," Mrs. Washington encouraged, noticing his transfixed expression. "She's been working on this fundraiser for months. It means the world to her." Alexander made his way through the crowd, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. As he approached, Zora spotted him, and her professional smile transformed into something more genuine. "You came," she said, sounding pleasantly surprised despite having invited him. "I said I would," Alexander replied. "You look stunning." Zora accepted the compliment with a gracious nod. "Thank you. This event is important to me. The center needs a new roof and updated computers for the job training program." "How much are you hoping to raise?" Alexander asked. "50,000 is the goal, though we'd be thrilled with 30, Zora replied, guiding him further into the ballroom. "Every bit helps." Alexander thought of his anonymous donation with satisfaction. "I'm sure you'll exceed your expectations." "From your lips to God's ears," Zora said with a smile. "Come, I want you to meet some people." For the next hour, Alexander was introduced to what felt like the entire Bronzeville community: teachers, social workers, small business owners, and residents of all ages. Each greeted Zora with genuine affection, and many expressed curiosity about her investor friend. Alexander was struck by how deeply embedded Zora was in this community. At the elite, she was just another server, skilled but replaceable. Here, she was essential, a connector, an advocate, someone who made things happen. Eventually, they found themselves at a quiet table as dinner was being served. The food was catered by local restaurants, including Harvest Moon, and while simpler than the fare at the elite, it was prepared with obvious care and skill. "This is quite an event," Alexander commented, genuinely impressed by the organization and atmosphere. "You've done an amazing job." "It takes a village," Zora replied modestly. "I'm just on the committee." "Everyone I've spoken to says you're the heart of this place," Alexander countered. "They're right." Zora looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just believe in what the center does. It changed my life when I needed it most." "How so?" Alexander asked gently, sensing an opening into her closely guarded past. Zora hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "After my father died when I was 12, my mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. This center became my second home: after-school programs, summer camps, college application help. When I got the scholarship to Howard, everyone here celebrated like I was family." "They are your family," Alexander observed. "Yes," Zora agreed, her expression softening. "When my mother got sick during my senior year, they stepped up again. Mrs. Washington helped me find resources for her care. Mama Esther gave me flexible hours at the restaurant." "I'm sorry about your mother," Alexander said. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Zora nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "Pancreatic cancer. It was quick, at least. But the medical bills..." She shook her head. "That's why I started at the elite. Better tips, better pay. And the restaurant dream? Mrs. Washington mentioned you'd pursued it before." A shadow crossed Zora's face. "Did she? That's a complicated story." Before she could elaborate, the evening's program began, with the center director taking the stage to welcome everyone and outline the fundraising goals. Alexander listened with half an ear, more interested in the woman beside him. Something had happened to Zora's restaurant dream, something painful enough that she'd set it aside until he'd inadvertently rekindled it. The speeches continued, followed by a short auction of donated items and services. Alexander bid on and won an authentic soul food dinner for 6, prepared by Mama Esther, earning an amused glance from Zora. "Planning to impress some business associates?" she asked. "Actually, I thought we could use it as a test dinner for potential investors in our restaurant," Alexander replied. "Assuming you're still interested in the partnership." The surprise on Zora's face was quickly replaced by thoughtful consideration. "I am," she said finally, "but I want to be fully transparent about my past experience." "I'm listening," Alexander encouraged, relieved she was finally opening up. "4 years ago, I tried to open my own place," Zora began, her voice low. "A small cafe focusing on healthy versions of soul food classics. I had savings from Howard, and my mother had left me a small life insurance policy. I found a location, developed a menu, even had the permits in process." She paused, taking a sip of water, her expression tightening. "Then I met James Armstrong. He was charming, successful, or so I thought. He convinced me to take him on as a partner, said he could double my investment, get us a better location." Alexander felt a surge of protective anger, already anticipating where this story was heading. "He took my money, all of it, and disappeared," Zora continued, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "Turned out he'd done the same to at least 3 other small business owners. The police tracked him to Mexico, but my savings were gone." "Zora, I'm so sorry," Alexander said, resisting the urge to reach for her hand. "That's inexcusable." She shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, though the hurt was still visible. "It was a hard lesson. Made me wary of too-good-to-be-true offers and charming businessmen." The implication wasn't lost on Alexander. "Like me," he said quietly. Zora met his eyes directly. "Can you blame me for being skeptical?" "Not at all," Alexander replied honestly. "I'd feel the same way. That's why I've been cautious about your proposal," Zora explained. "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice." "I understand," Alexander said, feeling a new weight of responsibility. "And I want to prove that your caution isn't necessary. Not with me." Zora studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "That's why I invited you tonight. I wanted you to see this part of my life, to understand where I come from and what matters to me. If we're going to be partners, we need trust." The irony of her words stung Alexander. Here she was, extending trust, while the entire premise of their meeting had been built on a bet he was now deeply ashamed of. "I won't let you down," he promised, the words feeling inadequate against the magnitude of his deception. Zora's smile was cautious but genuine. "We'll see." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dancing, more conversation, and the exciting announcement that the fundraiser had exceeded its goal by almost $20,000. Alexander saw Zora's eyes widen when the total was revealed, and he knew she was mentally calculating the numbers, perhaps wondering about his contribution. When the gala wound down, Alexander offered Zora a ride home. To his surprise, she accepted. "But just to the corner of my block," she clarified. "I'm still not quite ready to show you where I live." "Baby steps," Alexander agreed, understanding her continued caution. In the car, they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Zora spoke. "Thank you for coming tonight. It meant a lot." "Thank you for inviting me," Alexander replied sincerely. "It was an honor to see the community that helped shape you." Zora turned to look at him, her expression contemplative in the passing streetlights. "You're different than I expected, Alexander Montgomery." "Is that a good thing?" he asked, genuinely unsure. She smiled enigmatically. "I'm still deciding." When they reached her block, a quiet street lined with modest apartment buildings, Zora instructed James to stop. Before getting out, she hesitated, then leaned over and pressed a soft kiss to Alexander's cheek. "Good night, Alex," she said, and was gone before he could respond. Alexander touched his cheek, feeling the lingering warmth of her lips. In the rearview mirror, he caught James's knowing smile. "Not a word," Alexander warned, but couldn't suppress his own grin. As the car pulled away, his phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Where are you? We're at Allium waiting." The reminder of the bet, of Victor and his expectations, crashed through Alexander's contentment like a stone through glass. He'd completely forgotten about the double date. Situation changed. He texted back, "We'll explain tomorrow." Then he silenced his phone, unwilling to let Victor intrude further on this evening. The bet, the $10 million, his usual world of wealth and superficial connections, none of it seemed important compared to the simple gesture of Zora's kiss and the trust she was beginning to place in him. The question that haunted him now wasn't whether he could win the bet, but whether he deserved the genuine affection Zora might eventually offer. And more troublingly, what would happen when she inevitably discovered the truth. "You stood us up for a community center fundraiser?" Victor's incredulous voice carried across Alexander's office, despite the closed door. "Are you serious?" Alexander continued reviewing the proposed restaurant business plan on his tablet, refusing to give Victor the satisfaction of a reaction. It was important to Zora. Building trust takes time. "Trust?" Victor scoffed, dropping into one of the leather chairs opposite Alexander's desk. "You don't need her to trust you. You need her to fall in love with you. Those are entirely different goals." "Not for most people," Alexander replied, finally looking up. Victor studied him, eyes narrowing. "You're getting soft. Tell me you're not actually falling for this waitress." The question hit closer to home than Alexander cared to admit. Over the past few weeks, as he and Zora had worked on the restaurant concept, his admiration for her had grown exponentially. She was brilliant, principled, and possessed a quiet strength that he found increasingly captivating. The original bet seemed more distant and distasteful with each passing day. "The terms of our wager don't require me to maintain emotional distance," Alexander said carefully. Victor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "No, but they do require results. It's been over a month, Alex. The guys are starting to think you're stalling?" "I'm not stalling," Alexander snapped, his patience wearing thin. "These things can't be rushed." "Can't they?" Victor leaned forward, a sly smile spreading across his face. "What if I told you I had information that could accelerate your progress?" Alexander felt a flicker of unease. "What information?" "About your waitress's ex-partner, the one who scammed her." Victor's smug expression suggested he'd done some digging of his own. "James Armstrong, currently residing in Puerto Vallarta, living quite comfortably on stolen funds." "How do you know about that?" Alexander demanded, a protective anger surging through him. "Please," Victor waved dismissively. "You think you're the only one who can run a background check? I got curious when you missed our double date." Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's none of your business." "Oh, but it is," Victor countered. $10 million makes it my business. Here's what I'm thinking. You track down this Armstrong guy, recover her money, play the hero. She falls into your arms, bet one, everyone's happy. Except that would be manipulation, Alexander argued, though a part of him was already considering how he might actually find Armstrong and recover Zora's stolen savings. "It's called strategy," Victor corrected. "Look, the clock is ticking. Either you make significant progress soon, or the guys and I might start to wonder if you're ever going to close this deal." After Victor left, Alexander sat contemplating the suggestion. Finding Armstrong and recovering Zora's money would certainly help her. She deserved justice. But doing so to win a bet felt fundamentally wrong, a betrayal of the trust they were building. He was still mulling this over when Marissa entered with his afternoon schedule. "The real estate agent confirmed your 2 p.m. at the Fulton Market location," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "And Ms. Johnson called. She asked if you could meet her at Harvest Moon at 7 instead of the office. Something about wanting Mama Esther's input on the menu concepts." Alexander nodded, a smile tugging at his lips at the thought of seeing Zora again. "Clear my evening." "Already done," Marissa replied, a knowing look in her eyes. "You've been spending a lot of time on this restaurant project." "It's important," Alexander said simply. Marissa hesitated at the door. "She seems different from your usual associates, in a good way." Alexander regarded his assistant thoughtfully. Marissa had been with him for 8 years and had seen a parade of socialites and models pass through his life. Her subtle approval of Zora meant something. "She is different," he acknowledged. "Very different." The Fulton Market property was perfect. A former industrial space with high ceilings, exposed brick, and large windows. Close enough to Chicago's restaurant district to attract the right clientele, but far enough from the elite to avoid direct competition. Alexander could already envision the layout Zora had described: open kitchen, community table, private dining area that could double as a teaching space. "What do you think?" he asked the real estate agent, a polished woman who specialized in commercial properties for upscale businesses. "It's a hot area," she replied. "This won't stay on the market long. If you're serious, I'd recommend making an offer today." Alexander nodded. "Draw up the paperwork. I'll present it to my partner tonight." The agent's eyebrows rose slightly at partner, but she simply nodded and began typing on her tablet. Alexander walked the space alone, imagining Zora's reaction. Would her eyes light up the way they did when she talked about creating opportunities for her community? Would she finally allow herself to believe this dream could become reality? He hoped so, because somewhere along the way, making Zora happy had become important to him, more important than the bet, more important than his pride. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, it felt like clarity. Harvest Moon was quiet when Alexander arrived that evening, the dinner rush not yet begun. Zora sat at a corner table with Mama Esther, both of them poring over papers spread across the surface. They looked up when the bell above the door announced his entrance. "Right on time," Zora said with approval. She wore jeans and a simple blue blouse, her hair in a neat bun, casual but professional. "We're reviewing menu ideas. Don't just stand there," Mama Esther called, gesturing him over. "Come tell me if these prices make sense to your rich friends." Alexander chuckled as he joined them, noting the easy rapport between the two women. "My friends don't look at prices, Mama Esther. They just assume if it's expensive, it must be good." "Foolishness," the older woman scoffed, but her eyes twinkled with amusement. "Zora says you found a location?" "Possibly," Alexander replied, taking the seat beside Zora. Their shoulders brushed briefly, and he felt a small thrill at the contact. "I'd like to show it to you both before making an offer." Zora's eyes widened. "You're ready to make an offer? Already?" "If you approve," Alexander clarified. "It won't stay available long." Mama Esther glanced between them, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "I'll get us some coffee while you two discuss business." She rose with surprising agility for her age and headed toward the kitchen. Once they were alone, Zora turned to Alexander, excitement breaking through her usually composed demeanor. "Tell me about the space." As Alexander described the property, pulling up photos on his phone, Zora leaned closer, her professional reserve momentarily forgotten. The scent of her perfume, something subtle and spicy, distracted him briefly. "It's perfect," she breathed, studying the images. "The kitchen layout, the natural light. We could put the community table right in the center. The training kitchen could be in the back area." "My thoughts exactly," Alexander agreed, pleased by her enthusiasm. "There's even space for a small urban garden on the roof." Zora looked up at him, her eyes shining with genuine emotion. "Alex, this is really happening, isn't it?" The vulnerability in her question touched something deep within him. "If you want it to," he said softly. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Alexander felt the air between them change, charged with something beyond professional partnership. Zora's gaze dropped briefly to his lips, then back to his eyes, a question in them he desperately wanted to answer. Before either could move, Mama Esther returned with coffee and her signature cornbread. "Don't mean to interrupt whatever moment you two were having," she said, not sounding sorry at all, "but I need to talk business." Zora straightened, the moment broken, though a faint blush colored her cheeks. "Of course, Mama." I want to be clear about my role, the older woman said, settling back into her chair. I'm happy to consult, train your staff, even help develop recipes, but I won't leave Harvest Moon. We wouldn't ask you to, Alexander assured her. Your place is here. Mama Esther nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. Now, about these prices, they're too low. Quality ingredients cost money, and people will pay for authenticity. They spent the next hour discussing menu concepts, pricing strategies, and staffing needs. Alexander was impressed by the detailed thought both women had put into the project. This wasn't just a dream for Zora anymore. It was becoming a concrete business plan. When Mama Esther finally excused herself to oversee dinner preparations, Alexander and Zora remained at the table, their conversation shifting to more personal topics. I looked into your background, Zora admitted suddenly, after the fundraiser. Alexander tensed, unsure what she might have discovered. Oh? Nothing invasive, she clarified. Just public information. Your company, your philanthropic work. She hesitated. And your dating history. Alexander winced internally. The tabloids had documented his relationships with various models and socialites over the years, none lasting more than a few months. Not exactly flattering research, he acknowledged. No, Zora agreed, her expression unreadable. It made me wonder why you're really interested in this partnership. In me. The directness of her question caught Alexander off guard. The honest answer, that it had begun as a bet but had evolved into genuine interest, was impossible to give. You're different, he said finally, echoing what he'd told Marissa earlier. You care about things beyond status and money. Your passion for this project, for your community, it's refreshing. Zora studied him, searching for sincerity. And that's enough to invest millions in a restaurant concept from a waitress with a failed business in her past? You're not just a waitress, Alexander said firmly. You're a Howard graduate with business acumen, community connections, and a vision that has real potential. Your past experience, painful as it was, only adds to your knowledge base. Something in his earnestness seemed to reach her. Zora's expression softened, and she reached across the table to cover his hand with hers, the first time she'd initiated physical contact beyond the brief kiss on his cheek after the fundraiser. Thank you for believing in me, she said quietly. Not many would, after what happened with James. Alexander turned his hand to clasp hers, savoring the connection. James was a fool who saw only money. I see you. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Zora withdrew her hand slowly, but the energy between them remained, a tangible thing. We should go look at the property, she suggested, gathering her papers. If it's as perfect as it seems, I don't want to lose it. They walked to Alexander's waiting car, their shoulders occasionally brushing, the evening air warm with early summer. James raised an eyebrow at Alexander in the rearview mirror but said nothing as they headed toward Fulton Market. The property looked even better in the golden evening light, the large windows reflecting the sunset. Alexander watched Zora as she explored the space, noting how she moved with purpose, already envisioning what could be. The kitchen would be here, she said, gesturing to the back area. Open concept, so diners can see the training happening. The community table would run through the center, bringing everyone together regardless of whether they're paying full price or using the sliding scale. What about there? Alexander pointed to a loft area overlooking the main floor. Private dining that could double as a classroom for cooking lessons? Zora's face lit up. Exactly, and we could display work from local artists, maybe have live music on weekends. As they walked the space together, their vision for the restaurant becoming more concrete with each step, Alexander felt something shift within him. This wasn't just about winning a bet anymore, not even close. It was about creating something meaningful with this extraordinary woman who had somehow worked her way past his carefully constructed defenses. I want to make an offer, Zora said decisively as they completed their tour. This is it, Alex. This is where we build our dream. Our dream. The words warmed him in a way no business deal ever had. "I'll call the agent tonight," he promised. Outside, as dusk settled over the city, they stood close, neither quite ready to end the evening. In the dimming light, Zora's face was softer, the professional mask she usually wore falling away to reveal the woman beneath. "Thank you," she said simply, "for making this possible." "We're partners," Alexander replied, the word feeling inadequate for what was developing between them. "This is just the beginning." Zora nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Then, with a boldness that surprised him, she rose on tiptoes and kissed him. Not on the cheek this time, but softly on the lips. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sent electricity coursing through Alexander's veins. Before he could respond, she stepped back, her expression a mix of surprise at her own action and something deeper, more complex. "Good night, Alex," she said, her voice slightly breathless. As he watched her walk to the L station, refusing his offer of a ride with a gentle shake of her head, Alexander touched his lips, still feeling the impression of hers. His phone buzzed, Victor, no doubt, demanding an update. But for once, Alexander didn't care about the bet or the money or what Victor thought. All that mattered was that Zora Johnson had kissed him, and it had felt more significant than any relationship he'd had in years. The bet might have brought them together, but something far more powerful was keeping them that way. And for the first time, Alexander allowed himself to acknowledge what that something might be. The weeks following their kiss blurred together in a whirlwind of activity. The offer on the Fulton Market property was accepted, contracts were signed, and renovation plans drawn up. Alexander and Zora spent nearly every evening together, their partnership evolving in ways that transcended business. They hadn't discussed the kiss, but something had fundamentally changed between them. The professional boundaries Zora had so carefully maintained began to soften. Their conversations lingered longer, their touches became more frequent, a hand on an arm while reviewing plans, shoulders pressed together as they studied menu concepts, fingers brushing when passing documents. For Alexander, these small intimacies meant more than the physical relationships he'd had in the past. There was an authenticity to his connection with Zora that made everything feel new, significant. But as his feelings deepened, so did his guilt about the bet. Victor's inquiries grew more frequent, more pointed, and increasingly difficult to deflect. "We're meeting for drinks tonight," Victor announced, cornering Alexander after a board meeting. "Non-negotiable. The guys want to know why they haven't met the famous Zora yet." "We're busy," Alexander replied tersely. "The restaurant opens in 2 months." "Exactly my point," Victor countered. 6 months was the time frame. "You're running out of runway, my friend." The reminder of the deadline sent a spike of anxiety through Alexander. Not because he feared losing the money. 10 million was insignificant compared to what he stood to lose if Zora discovered the truth, but because he was increasingly uncertain about the end game. What happened when the 6 months were up? What happened if Zora did fall in love with him, expressed that love, and the bet was technically won? The questions haunted him as he made his way to the restaurant site, where Zora was overseeing the installation of kitchen equipment. She'd taken a leave of absence from the elite to focus on the project, throwing herself into every aspect with characteristic dedication. When Alexander arrived, she was deep in conversation with the head chef they'd hired, a talented woman from the South Side who had trained at the Culinary Institute of America before returning to Chicago to raise her family. Zora had been adamant about hiring staff from the community whenever possible, creating the opportunities she'd always envisioned. She looked up when Alexander entered, her face lighting up in a way that made his heart race. "Perfect timing. Chef Maya was just walking me through her suggestions for the seasonal menu rotation." Alexander greeted them both, noting the natural authority Zora had developed as the project progressed. Gone was the cautious waitress, replaced by a confident restaurateur who commanded respect from contractors, staff, and suppliers alike. "The place is really coming together," he observed, taking in the newly installed lighting fixtures that cast a warm glow over the space. The community table, a massive piece crafted from reclaimed wood, dominated the center of the room, while the open kitchen gleamed with top-of-the-line equipment. "Thanks to you," Zora said, after Chef Maya excused herself to continue inventory. "This is all you," Alexander corrected. "I just provided capital. You're the heart and soul of this place." Zora stepped closer, her expression softening. "We're partners, remember? Equal credit." The word partners hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Were they still just business partners? Friends? Something more? "About that," Alexander began, knowing he needed to address Victor's demand but unsure how to do so without raising questions he couldn't answer honestly. "Some of my investors are curious about the project. They're asking to meet you." Zora raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were the sole investor." "I am," Alexander clarified quickly, "but these are people I often co-invest with. They're interested in the concept." "Victor Blackwell?" Zora asked, surprising him with her knowledge. "I looked him up after you mentioned him. He doesn't seem the type to care about community-focused restaurants." Alexander silently cursed himself for ever mentioning Victor. "He's broadening his portfolio." Zora didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. "All right, when?" "Tonight? Drinks at the aviary." It was a high-end cocktail lounge, the kind of place Alexander frequented with his usual crowd but worlds away from Harvest Moon or the community center. Zora hesitated. "I'm not dressed for that." She gestured to her jeans and simple blouse, now slightly dusty from the construction site. "You look beautiful," Alexander said automatically and meant it. "But we could stop by your place if you want to change." It was a casual suggestion, but he realized immediately its implications. In all their time together, Zora had never invited him to her home. It remained her private domain, a boundary he'd respected without question. To his surprise, Zora considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but just so I can change, no house tour." "Of course," Alexander agreed, trying to hide his shock. They finished reviewing the day's progress, then headed out together in Alexander's car. Zora directed James to a modest apartment building in Bronzeville, brick with a well-maintained entrance, but nothing luxurious. "Wait here," she instructed, but then paused. "Actually, you can come up, just for a minute." Alexander followed her into the building, noting the clean but worn hallways, the faint smell of cooking from neighboring apartments, the sounds of life behind closed doors, so different from the sterile silence of his own luxury high-rise. Zora's apartment was on the 3rd floor, a one-bedroom with simple furnishings but touches that made it distinctly hers. Bookshelves overflowing with literature and cookbooks, plants flourishing on every available surface, framed photographs of her mother and the community center family. "It's not much," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "It's perfect," Alexander replied honestly. "It's so you." She smiled, pleased by his response. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll be quick." While Zora changed in the bedroom, Alexander examined the photographs more closely. Zora as a child with a woman who shared her smile, her mother, he presumed. Zora in cap and gown at her Howard graduation, Zora with Mama Esther and the Harvest Moon staff. Each image revealed another piece of her story, another facet of the woman he was increasingly certain he was falling in love with. One photograph in particular caught his eye. Zora standing proudly in front of a small storefront, holding a set of keys. The sign above the door was partially visible. Soul. "That was my cafe," Zora said quietly, having emerged from the bedroom without him noticing. "Soul nourishment. Before James took everything." She'd changed into a simple black dress that hugged her curves without being overtly sexy, paired with heeled boots and a colorful scarf that added a touch of personality. Her hair was down, framing her face in soft coils. "You look amazing," Alexander said, momentarily distracted from the photograph. "Thanks," she replied, then nodded toward the picture. "That was 3 days before I met James. I was so proud, so excited. I thought I'd finally achieved my dream." The sadness in her voice made Alexander's chest ache. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. "You're achieving it now, and no one can take it away this time." Zora looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her amber eyes. "Promise?" It was a loaded question, one that struck at the heart of his deception. Could he promise not to hurt her when their entire relationship was founded on a lie? "I promise to do everything in my power to protect your dream," he said carefully. It wasn't quite what she'd asked, but it was the truest answer he could give. Zora seemed to accept this, squeezing his hand before releasing it. "We should go. Your investors are waiting." The aviary was crowded when they arrived, the city's elite sipping elaborate cocktails in the sleek, modern space. Victor had reserved a private area in the back, where he sat with 2 other men from the original dinner at the elite. Alexander felt Zora tense beside him as they approached. He placed a reassuring hand on the small of her back, leaning close to whisper, "Just an hour. Then we can leave." Victor rose as they approached, his smile predatory as he took in Zora. "The famous Ms. Johnson. We finally meet." "Mr. Blackwell," Zora replied coolly, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "Alexander speaks highly of you." "Does he?" Victor raised an eyebrow, shooting Alexander an amused glance. How diplomatic of him. The other men introduced themselves, both venture capitalists with whom Alexander had done business for years. They ordered drinks, and the conversation initially remained focused on the restaurant project, with Zora confidently fielding questions about the concept, staffing, and anticipated clientele. Alexander watched with pride as she handled herself with poise, unfazed by the casual displays of wealth around her or the occasionally condescending tone of Victor's questions. "So, a sliding scale payment model," Victor mused, swirling his whiskey. "Doesn't that just encourage freeloaders?" "Not at all," Zora replied evenly. "Studies show that when people are trusted to pay what they can afford, they tend to be fair. Those who can pay more often do, subsidizing those who pay less. It builds community ownership." "Fascinating perspective," Victor said, not sounding fascinated at all. "And what about your personal background? Alexander mentioned you worked at the elite, but were there other fine dining experiences that prepared you for this venture?" The subtle emphasis on personal made Alexander tense. Was Victor fishing for information about Zora's past failure? Had he discovered more than he'd let on? "I've worked in restaurants since college," Zora answered smoothly. "From family-owned places like Harvest Moon to high-end establishments like the elite. Each offered valuable lessons in different aspects of the business." She didn't mention Soul Nourishment or James Armstrong, and Alexander felt a surge of protective gratitude. "And how did you and Alexander meet again?" one of the other men asked, his tone deceptively casual. "I served his table at the elite," Zora said simply. "We got to talking about restaurant concepts, and here we are." "Here you are indeed," Victor echoed, his gaze shifting between them speculatively. "And how would you characterize your relationship now? Still strictly business?" Alexander opened his mouth to intervene, but Zora beat him to it. "Our relationship is evolving," she said, surprising both men with her directness, "which I'm sure is of great interest to Alexander's investment partners." The subtle sarcasm wasn't lost on Victor, whose smile tightened. "Just looking out for my friend's interests. I'm quite capable of managing my own interests," Alexander interjected, placing his hand over Zora's on the table. A clear statement. Victor's eyes narrowed at the gesture. "Evidently." The tension was broken by the arrival of more cocktails, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But Alexander noticed Victor watching them carefully, cataloging every interaction, every casual touch, every shared glance. After the promised hour, Alexander made their excuses. Victor walked them partway to the exit, pulling Alexander aside briefly while Zora collected her coat. "She's good," Victor admitted grudgingly. "Smart, poised, not easily intimidated. I can almost see why you're so invested." "She's extraordinary," Alexander corrected, his voice low but firm. "But does she love you?" Victor pressed. "That's the question worth 10 million, remember?" The crude reminder made Alexander's jaw clench. This isn't about the money anymore. Victor studied him, realization dawning. Well, the great Alexander Montgomery actually falling for the target. How deliciously ironic. "Don't call her that," Alexander snapped, his patience evaporating. "Touched a nerve, have I?" Victor smirked. "Just remember, the clock is ticking. 2 months left, and if she hasn't said those 3 little words by then, you lose. Unless—" His smile turned calculating. "You want to call off the bet? Forfeit the 10 million now?" It was a trap, and Alexander knew it. Calling off the bet would mean admitting defeat, satisfying Victor's competitive nature while still leaving Zora in the dark about the whole sordid arrangement. "The bet stands," Alexander said finally, hating himself for it but seeing no clean way out. "Thought so." Victor nodded, satisfied. "Good luck, old friend. You're going to need it." As Alexander rejoined Zora, he felt the weight of his deception like a physical burden. She smiled up at him, trusting and warm, unaware of the conversation that had just transpired. "Ready to go?" she asked. "More than ready," he replied, guiding her out into the night air, away from Victor and the reminder of his betrayal. In the car, Zora was quiet, thoughtful. Finally, she said, "Your friends aren't what I expected." "They're business associates," Alexander corrected. "There's a difference." She studied him in the darkness, her face illuminated by passing streetlights. "Do you have actual friends, Alex? People who know the real you?" The question caught him off guard with its insight and gentle concern. "Not many," he admitted. "Maybe none. Until you." The simple honesty of his answer seemed to touch her. Zora reached for his hand, interlacing their fingers. "I'm glad you let me see the real Alexander Montgomery." The irony of her words twisted in his gut. She didn't know the real him. Not completely. Not the part that had made a callous bet about her affections. But as they rode in silence, hands joined in the darkness, Alexander realized he was finally beginning to know the real himself. And that person was increasingly at odds with the man who had agreed to Victor's wager all those weeks ago. "Tomorrow's the big day," Zora said, her voice a mix of excitement and anxiety as they stood in the nearly completed restaurant. "I can hardly believe it's real." Alexander watched her as she moved through the space, making final adjustments to table settings and checking that everything was perfect for the soft opening. The past 2 months had transformed not only the industrial building into an inviting restaurant, but also their relationship into something he'd never experienced before. Something genuine and deep. "It's real," he assured her, coming to stand beside her at the community table. "And it's going to be extraordinary." Zora turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done this without you." "That's not true," Alexander said, taking her hands in his. "You had the vision, the expertise, the passion. I just provided resources." She shook her head. "It's more than that. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. After James, I was too afraid to try again. You changed that." The mention of James Armstrong sent a pang of guilt through Alexander. Following Victor's revelation, he'd quietly hired investigators to track down the con man in Mexico. They'd located him living comfortably in Puerto Vallarta, just as Victor had said. Alexander had been tempted, sorely tempted, to pursue legal action, to recover Zora's money and expose Armstrong's fraud. But he hadn't. Not because it wouldn't help win the bet, but because using Zora's past pain as a manipulation tactic felt unconscionable. If Armstrong was to face justice, it would be because Zora decided to pursue it, not because Alexander orchestrated it to make himself look heroic. "You changed me too," Alexander admitted, the words coming easier than he expected. "Made me see beyond profit margins and status. Made me want to create something meaningful." Zora's smile softened as she reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Who would have thought a CEO and a waitress could make such a good team?" "I think we're more than a team now," Alexander replied, his voice low and intimate. The air between them charged with possibility, with words unspoken but increasingly undeniable. Over the past weeks, their relationship had evolved organically, professional boundaries dissolving into something far more personal. They'd shared meals, dreams, pieces of their pasts, everything except the lie that had brought them together. That lie weighed heavier on Alexander with each passing day. The deadline Victor had set was approaching, just 2 weeks away now, and Alexander still had no solution to his moral quandary. How could he tell Zora the truth without destroying everything they'd built? How could he not tell her and still claim to care for her? Before he could speak, the door opened and Mama Esther entered, carrying a large basket covered with a cloth. "Still working? It's past midnight, children." The moment broken, Zora stepped back, though her eyes lingered on Alexander's face. "Final preparations. Everything has to be perfect." "Nothing is ever perfect," Mama Esther said wisely, setting her basket on the counter. "But this comes close. You've built something beautiful here, both of you." Alexander felt both pride and shame at her words. He had helped build something beautiful, but on a foundation that threatened to crumble beneath them. "I brought the special hot sauce for tomorrow," Mama Esther continued, unaware of his inner turmoil. "And some of my cornbread for you two. Can't think straight on empty stomachs." They sat together at the community table, sharing Mama Esther's cornbread and discussing last-minute details for the opening. The guest list included local community leaders, food critics, potential investors for future locations, and, at Alexander's insistence despite Zora's reluctance, Victor Blackwell. "I still don't understand why he needs to be here," Zora said after Mama Esther left, her expression clouding. "He obviously doesn't care about our mission." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's complicated, but he's been part of this from the beginning, in a way." "What does that mean?" Zora asked, her perceptiveness catching the odd phrasing. "Just that he was there when I first met you," Alexander hedged. "At the Elite." Zora studied him, and for a moment Alexander feared she'd push further, but she simply nodded, accepting his explanation. "Well, it's your guest list too. I just hope he doesn't make anyone uncomfortable with his Wall Street attitude." "I'll keep him in line," Alexander promised, relieved at the temporary reprieve from his conscience. After locking up, they walked together toward where James was waiting with the car. The summer night was warm, the streets still lively with people enjoying the weather. Zora had grown comfortable enough to accept rides from Alexander now, though she still maintained some boundaries, declining invitations to his penthouse, for instance, while increasingly welcoming him into her more modest home. "Stay with me tonight," she said suddenly, breaking their companionable silence. "It's late, and we have to be back early tomorrow. My place is closer." Alexander glanced at her, surprised by the invitation. They had shared kisses, increasingly passionate ones, but had yet to cross the final physical threshold in their relationship. Each time they'd approached it, Zora had pulled back, not quite ready to be fully vulnerable. "Are you sure?" he asked, not wanting to presume. Zora met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure." Alexander instructed James to drop them at Zora's apartment and take the rest of the night off. The driver's knowing smile earned him a mock-stern look from his employer. In Zora's apartment, the air was thick with anticipation. They moved around each other with a new awareness, the pretense of just being business partners long abandoned. "Wine?" Zora offered, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Please," Alexander replied, removing his jacket and draping it over a chair. She poured 2 glasses of red wine, her hands steady despite the nervous energy he could sense in her. When she handed him his glass, their fingers brushed deliberately, the simple contact sending electricity through him. "To tomorrow," she said, raising her glass. "To us," Alexander countered softly. They drank, eyes locked over the rims of their glasses. When Zora set hers down, she moved closer, eliminating the careful distance she'd always maintained between them. "I never expected you," she said quietly. "Never expected any of this." "Neither did I," Alexander admitted, setting his own glass aside. "You've turned my world upside down, Zora Johnson." She smiled, a slow, warm curve of her lips that made his heart race. "In a good way, I hope." "The best way." He leaned down as she reached up, their lips meeting in what began as a gentle kiss, but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more needful. Alexander's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as her hands slid up to his shoulders, his neck into his hair. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Zora took his hand and led him toward her bedroom. No words were necessary. The decision had been made. In the soft darkness of her room, they undressed each other slowly, reverently. Alexander took his time, allowing Zora to set the pace, mindful of her hesitancy in past encounters. But tonight, there was no hesitation in her movements, no holding back. She wanted him as much as he wanted her. Their coming together was tender at first, then increasingly passionate as they discovered each other's bodies, each other's desires. For Alexander, it was unlike any physical experience he'd ever had, not because of any particular technique or expertise, but because of the emotional connection that underscored every touch, every kiss, every shared breath. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Zora's head resting on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The comfortable silence between them felt significant, precious. "I've never brought anyone here," Zora admitted softly. "Not since I moved in after my mother died." Alexander tightened his arm around her, honored by the trust she was placing in him. "Thank you for letting me in." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her expression serious in the dim light filtering through the curtains. "I'm not just talking about my apartment, Alex." "I know," he said, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know what it means." Zora studied him for a long moment, then took a deep breath. "I love you." The words, spoken simply but with absolute certainty, both elated and devastated Alexander. Here was what Victor had demanded, a genuine declaration of love, uttered without prompting. The bet was technically won, but it felt like the most profound loss. "You don't have to say it back," Zora added quickly, misinterpreting his silence. "I just wanted you to know." Alexander pulled her close, his heart pounding with conflicting emotions. "I love you too," he said, the truth of it resonating through his entire being. "More than I thought possible." They kissed again, sealing the declaration, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. The soft opening of Solon Table began at noon the next day with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by local officials and community leaders. Zora, radiant in a deep blue dress that complemented her skin tone, did the honors while Alexander stood proudly beside her. The restaurant was everything they'd envisioned, warm, inviting, and buzzing with energy. The community table was already filled with a diverse group of diners, from business executives to families from the neighborhood, all sharing the experience of Chef Maya's extraordinary food. "It's perfect," Alexander murmured to Zora as they moved among the guests, greeting and thanking them for coming. "Almost," she replied, her smile intimate, meant only for him. The memory of the previous night, of whispered confessions and shared pleasure, created an invisible bond between them as they worked the room. Victor arrived fashionably late, accompanied by two of the other men who had been present at the original dinner at the Elite. Alexander felt a surge of anxiety at their appearance but masked it with a professional smile. "Impressive," Victor commented, surveying the packed restaurant. "You've actually pulled it off." "Did you doubt we would?" Zora asked, her tone pleasant but with an underlying edge. Victor's smile was calculating as his gaze shifted between them. "Let's just say I had questions about the sustainability of the partnership." Alexander stepped slightly closer to Zora, a subtle but clear statement. "The partnership is stronger than ever." "So I see," Victor replied meaningfully. "Might we have a word in private, Alex? Partner to partner?" Before Alexander could refuse, Victor had already moved toward the small private dining area, clearly expecting to be followed. With a reassuring glance at Zora, Alexander reluctantly excused himself. "What do you want, Victor?" he asked once they were alone. "To congratulate you," Victor said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "My sources tell me there was a rather significant development last night. A certain three-word phrase was exchanged." Alexander stiffened. "You had me followed?" "Please," Victor scoffed. "Give me some credit. The building superintendent in Zora's apartment is an old business associate. He mentioned you didn't leave last night." He raised an eyebrow suggestively. "Combine that with the way you two are looking at each other today, and it doesn't take a genius to connect the dots." "This conversation is over," Alexander said, turning to leave. "Not quite," Victor countered, his voice hardening. "The bet's been won, technically, but I wonder if you've considered what happens next, when she inevitably discovers the truth?" Alexander faced him, anger building. "There's nothing to discover." "No?" Victor's smile turned predatory. "So Zora knows that your entire relationship began as a wager? That you pursued her because I bet you $10 million you couldn't make her fall in love with you?" "Keep your voice down," Alexander hissed, glancing toward the door. "Touched a nerve?" Victor asked. "Here's what I think. You're in too deep. You actually fell for her, and now you're terrified she'll find out the truth." "You know nothing about my feelings for Zora," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "Maybe not," Victor conceded. "But I know this. Secrets have a way of coming out, especially in our circle. And when this one does—" He left the sentence unfinished, the threat implicit. "Is that blackmail, Victor?" Alexander asked, his hands clenching into fists. "Call it friendly advice," Victor replied smoothly. "Take the win, collect your $10 million, and walk away before she gets hurt worse than she would now." "Get out," Alexander said, his control slipping. "Get out now." Victor shrugged, unperturbed by Alexander's anger. "Your call. But remember, the truth always surfaces eventually. Better she hear it from you than someone else." As Victor sauntered away, rejoining his companions at their table, Alexander remained frozen, Victor's words echoing in his mind. The choice before him was clear, but impossible. Continue living the lie and risk devastating Zora when the truth inevitably emerged, or confess everything now and almost certainly lose her. Either way, Alexander realized with sickening clarity he stood to lose far more than $10 million. He stood to lose the woman he loved, the woman who had, against all odds, helped him discover his better self. 3 weeks after opening, Soul & Table had become Chicago's most talked-about restaurant. The innovative concept, combining excellent food with a mission to serve the community, had captured attention beyond even Alexander's expectations. Food critics raved, celebrities requested tables, and most importantly, to Zora, neighborhood residents filled the community table daily, some paying full price, others what they could afford. But while the restaurant thrived, Alexander was drowning in guilt. Every morning he woke beside Zora in either her apartment or his penthouse, watching her peaceful sleep and wrestling with the same impossible choice. Tell her the truth and lose her, or continue the lie and betray her trust even more deeply. The deadline Victor had imposed had come and gone. The bet was technically won. Zora had said she loved him, without prompting, and clearly meant it. The $10 million was his. Yet Alexander hadn't contacted Victor to collect, hadn't acknowledged the win in any way. His avoidance strategy was working, until Victor cornered him at his office one afternoon, barging past Marissa with typical entitlement. "Time to pay up," Victor announced, dropping into a chair across from Alexander's desk. Alexander didn't look up from his laptop. "I'm busy, Victor." "Too busy to collect $10 million? That's not like you." Victor leaned forward, studying Alexander with calculating eyes. "Unless you've developed a conscience. How inconvenient." Alexander finally met his gaze. "The money doesn't matter." "Maybe not to you," Victor replied, "but the terms of our agreement were clear. She said she loves you, you won, we pay. Unless—" his eyes narrowed, "you're planning to tell her." The possibility had consumed Alexander's thoughts for weeks. Each time he resolved to confess, he'd look at Zora, her eyes alight with passion for their shared project, her smile when she spoke of their future plans, and the words would die in his throat. "My relationship with Zora is none of your business anymore," Alexander said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "The bet is over." Victor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That's not how this works. We had a deal, backed by legally binding NDAs. You collect your winnings, we all move on. And if I don't want the money? Irrelevant." Victor waved dismissively. "The point was never the money. It was the game. You won, we lost. That's the story. What happens with the waitress afterward is your concern." "Her name is Zora," Alexander said, his patience fraying, "and she deserves better than to be collateral damage in our sick game." Victor studied him, genuine curiosity replacing his usual smirk. "You really do love her, don't you? The great Alexander Montgomery, brought low by a waitress from the South Side." "There's nothing low about loving Zora," Alexander countered. "If anything, she's elevated me, made me see how empty my life was before." "How poetic," Victor mocked, though something like discomfort flickered in his eyes. "But it doesn't change the facts. The bet happened. You pursued her because of it, and sooner or later, she'll find out." "Not from me," Alexander said firmly, "and not from you, unless you want a lawsuit for violating the NDA." Victor rose, straightening his Italian suit. "I don't need to tell her. These things have a way of revealing themselves. Secrets always surface, Alex. Always. Better prepare yourself for when this one does." After Victor left, Alexander sat motionless, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Victor was right. Secrets had a way of emerging at the worst possible moment, and this particular secret could destroy everything he and Zora had built together. He had to tell her. Today. Before someone else did. His resolution lasted until he arrived at the restaurant that evening and saw Zora in her element, moving confidently among tables, greeting regulars by name, checking in with the kitchen staff. She'd never looked more beautiful, more fulfilled. When she spotted him, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart ache. "There you are. I was just about to call. We got the feature in Chicago Magazine. They're calling us revolutionary and the future of ethical dining. Can you believe it?" Alexander returned her smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's incredible. You deserve every accolade." "We deserve it," she corrected, rising on tiptoes to kiss him briefly. "Partner." The word twisted in his gut. Partner, equal, honest. Everything he hadn't been from the beginning. "We need to talk," he said, the words coming out more seriously than he'd intended. Zora's smile faltered. "That sounds ominous. Is everything okay?" "Not here," Alexander said, glancing around at the busy restaurant. "After closing?" She studied his face, concern replacing her joy. "You're scaring me, Alex. What's going on?" "It's complicated," he hedged. There are things we need to discuss." Before Zora could press further, Chef Maya called her to the kitchen to address an issue with a supplier. She went reluctantly, throwing a worried glance over her shoulder. Alexander moved to the bar, ordering a whiskey he didn't really want, just to occupy his hands. As he sat there, rehearsing how to tell Zora about the bet without destroying her completely, he overheard two men at a nearby high-top table. "That's him, Montgomery," one said in a stage whisper. "The guy who bet 10 million he could make the owner fall for him." Alexander froze, his blood turning to ice. "No way," the other replied, glancing over. "That can't be legal." "It's true. My brother works with Blackwell Securities. Said the whole thing was set up at some dinner months ago. Bunch of rich guys betting on whether he could get her to say, 'I love you.'" "That's messed up. Does she know?" "Doubt it. Would you stick around if you found out your relationship was based on a bet?" Alexander's hand tightened around his glass. Victor. Despite the NDA, he'd leaked the story, probably through carefully orchestrated rumors that couldn't be traced directly back to him. The bastard couldn't stand losing, even when he technically hadn't. Abandoning his drink, Alexander moved quickly to intercept the men before they could spread the rumor further within the restaurant. But as he approached their table, he saw with horror that Zora was already there, water pitcher in hand, her face a frozen mask of disbelief. She'd heard everything. Their eyes met across the room, and Alexander saw the precise moment understanding dawned, followed immediately by hurt so profound it physically pained him to witness. Without a word, Zora set down the pitcher and walked toward the kitchen, her back ramrod straight, her movements mechanical. Alexander followed, heart pounding. "Zora, wait. Please, I can explain." She didn't stop until they reached the small office off the kitchen. Once inside, she turned to face him, her expression devastatingly calm. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander could have lied, could have dismissed it as malicious gossip, bought himself time. But he was done with lies. "Yes," he admitted, the single word carrying the weight of months of deception. "But it's not that simple." $10 million, Zora cut him off, her voice eerily controlled. "That was the price? To make me fall in love with you?" "It started that way," Alexander acknowledged, hating himself with every word. "Victor made the bet that night at the Elite. But Zora, it changed. I changed. What I feel for you is real." "Is it?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. The pain he saw there made him flinch. "How would either of us know? Everything from the moment you approached me was based on a lie." "Not everything," Alexander insisted, taking a step toward her. She backed away, maintaining the distance between them. "The restaurant, our partnership, the way I feel about you, those things are real." Zora laughed, a hollow sound devoid of humor. "Our partnership? You mean the one where you pretended to believe in my vision while using me to win a bet with your rich friends? That partnership?" "I do believe in your vision," Alexander said desperately. "Soul and table is everything we planned, everything you dreamed." "Stop!" Zora held up a hand, her composure finally cracking as tears welled in her eyes. "Just stop. I can't even look at you right now." The door opened, and Chef Maya poked her head in, concern evident on her face. "Everything okay? We've got orders backing up." Zora quickly wiped her eyes, professional mask sliding back into place. "Fine. I'll be right there." After Maya left, Zora turned back to Alexander, her expression hardening. "I need you to leave, now." "Zora, please," Alexander begged, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Let me explain everything. Not here, not now, but soon. When you're ready." "Ready," she repeated, voice cracking. "I trusted you. After everything with James, I swore I'd never be that vulnerable again. But you were so patient, so seemingly genuine. I thought you were different." She shook her head, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. "Turns out you're worse. At least James was honest about being in it for the money." Each word was a knife to Alexander's heart, made worse by the knowledge that he deserved every cut. "What I feel for you is real," he said again, the only truth he had left to offer. "It doesn't matter," Zora replied, wiping away the tear with an angry gesture. "Whatever you feel or think you feel, it's tainted, built on manipulation and lies." She took a deep breath, visibly pulling herself together. "I have a restaurant to run, please leave." "What about Soul and Table?" Alexander asked, grasping at straws. "We're partners, legally and financially." "Oh, I'm aware," Zora replied, bitterness seeping into her tone. "I've learned my lesson about business partnerships. We'll figure out the legal details later through lawyers. For now, I need you gone." Alexander knew he should respect her wishes, give her space, but the thought of walking away, of leaving things like this, was unbearable. "Zora, I love you. That wasn't part of the bet. That's real." For a moment something flickered in her eyes. Pain, longing, confusion, but it quickly hardened back into resolve. "Congratulations on your $10 million, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her formal tone a deliberate barrier between them. "I hope it was worth it." With that, she walked past him, back into the kitchen, back to the restaurant they'd built together, the physical manifestation of a relationship now shattered beyond repair. Alexander stood alone in the small office, the weight of his choices crushing him. He'd finally found something real, something that mattered more than money or status or winning, and he'd destroyed it with his own hands. Outside, he paused at the bar to settle his untouched drink, aware of curious glances from the two men whose conversation had exposed him. They avoided his eyes, suddenly fascinated by their phones. News would spread quickly now, the story too juicy to contain. Billionaire CEO bets on making Waitress fall in love. Waitress discovers truth. It would be everywhere by morning. As Alexander stepped into the warm Chicago night, his phone buzzed with a text from Victor. "Heard there was a scene at the restaurant. Sorry about that. When should I transfer the winnings?" Rage boiled through Alexander. Victor had orchestrated this. The accidental leak, the timing, all of it. Perhaps it was revenge for being ignored, for Alexander's refusal to acknowledge the bet's conclusion. Or perhaps Victor simply couldn't stand to see Alexander genuinely happy with someone who challenged the shallow values of their social circle. Regardless of Victor's motives, the damage was done. Zora knew the truth, and she wanted nothing to do with him. The restaurant they'd built together, her dream realized through his resources, was now a painful reminder of what might have been. Alexander's driver waited at the curb, face impassive as always. "Home, sir?" Alexander hesitated. His penthouse held no appeal, its sterile luxury a perfect reflection of the empty life he'd led before Zora. But where else could he go? He'd lost the only place he'd truly felt at home, by Zora's side. "Just drive," he instructed, sliding into the back seat. "Anywhere." As the car pulled away from Soul and Table, Alexander glanced back one last time. Through the window, he could see Zora moving among the tables, professional smile fixed in place, carrying on despite the pain he knew she must be feeling. She was strong, stronger than he'd ever been. She would survive this betrayal, just as she'd survived James Armstrong's theft of her savings. She would thrive, with or without him, but Alexander wasn't sure he could say the same for himself. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose something truly irreplaceable, something no amount of money could buy back. For 2 weeks, Alexander didn't go near Soul and Table. He sent a formal notice through his lawyers that Zora had full operational control of the restaurant and he would not interfere. He stopped answering Victor's increasingly smug texts. He buried himself in work, spending 18-hour days at the office, as if spreadsheets and acquisition plans could fill the Zora-shaped hole in his life. But they couldn't. Nothing could. The story had broken exactly as he'd feared. "Billionaire's $1 million love bet," screamed the tabloid headlines. More reputable outlets couched it in classier terms, ethics questions raised by unusual restaurant partnership. But the damage was the same. Zora's private pain had become public spectacle, her successful restaurant overshadowed by its salacious origin story. Alexander had tried to reach her. Calls, texts, even a handwritten letter delivered to her apartment, all met with silence. He'd respected her space, waiting for her anger to cool enough that she might be willing to hear him out. But after 2 weeks of silence, he couldn't wait any longer. Not after seeing the latest headline, Soul and Table Chef confirms owner buying out billionaire partner. Alexander stared at the article on his tablet, heart racing. Zora was trying to buy him out? With what money? The restaurant was successful, but nowhere near profitable enough yet for her to afford his half of the investment. The answer came 3 paragraphs in. Zora had found a new investor, Mama Esther's nephew, a successful surgeon who'd been quietly funding community projects for years. Together, they were offering to purchase Alexander's stake at full market value. He should have been relieved. This was the cleanest possible resolution. Zora would keep her restaurant. He would recover his investment. They could go their separate ways. It was rational, practical, fair, and completely unacceptable. Because Soul and Table wasn't just a business to Alexander anymore. It represented everything good that had come from his relationship with Zora, the values she'd taught him, the meaning she'd brought to his life, the person he'd become while loving her. Selling his stake felt like severing the last thread connecting them. In that moment, Alexander knew what he needed to do. It wouldn't win Zora back, that might be impossible now, but it might begin to make amends for the pain he'd caused. His first stop was Victor's office. "Finally!" Victor exclaimed when Alexander walked in unannounced. "I was beginning to think you'd fled the country. Come to collect your winnings at last?" Alexander didn't bother sitting. "You leaked the bet." Victor shrugged, not bothering to deny it. "I might have mentioned it to a few people who aren't known for their discretion, but I didn't violate the NDA, technically." "You deliberately destroyed my relationship." "Please," Victor scoffed. "You did that yourself the moment you agreed to the bet. I just accelerated the inevitable." Alexander studied the man he'd called a friend for over a decade, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Why? What did you gain from hurting her?" Something flickered in Victor's eyes, a brief flash of what might have been shame before his usual arrogance reasserted itself. "The bet was about you, not her. You were getting soft, forgetting who you are." "Or maybe I was discovering who I could be," Alexander countered. "Someone better than this." He gestured between them. "Better than games and bets and treating people like pawns." Victor laughed, though it sounded forced. "Listen to yourself. A few months with a waitress and suddenly you're all about moral improvement? That's not the Alexander Montgomery I know." "Maybe the Alexander Montgomery you know never really existed," Alexander replied quietly. Maybe he was just playing a role he thought he had to play. He placed a check on Victor's desk for $10 million. Victor stared at it, confusion evident. "What's this?" "I'm conceding the bet," Alexander explained. "You win, I lose." "But you didn't lose," Victor said slowly. "She said she loved you. We all heard about it." "The terms were that she had to say it and mean it," Alexander reminded him. "Given what's happened, I think we can agree she didn't mean it, not once she knew the truth." "That wasn't part of the deal," Victor protested. "You can't change the terms retroactively." "Sue me," Alexander suggested coldly. "Explain to a judge exactly what we bet on. I'm sure that would go well for your reputation." Victor pushed the check back across the desk. "I don't want your money." "Too bad. I've already transferred the full amount to your account. You can donate it if you don't want it." Alexander turned to leave, then paused. "This is the last time we'll speak, Victor. I've instructed my company to sever all business relationships with your firm. I suggest you find new social circles as well." "Over a woman?" Victor asked incredulously. "You're throwing away decades of connections over a waitress who already dumped you?" Alexander looked back at him with something like pity. "No, I'm throwing away decades of toxic connections because I finally recognize them for what they are. Zora just helped me see more clearly." As he walked out of Victor's office, Alexander felt lighter than he had in weeks. Cutting ties with Victor and the social circle he represented was long overdue, a necessary step toward becoming the person he wanted to be, whether Zora was in his life or not. His next stop was Soul and Table. Not to see Zora, he wouldn't ambush her in her workplace, but to deliver a package to the restaurant's lawyer who was expecting him. The lunch rush was in full swing when he arrived, the restaurant humming with energy and conversation. From the doorway, Alexander spotted Zora moving among the tables, stopping to chat with regulars. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes visible even from a distance, but her smile for the patrons seemed genuine. He waited until she disappeared into the kitchen before approaching the hostess, who recognized him immediately, eyes widening. "I'm not staying," he assured her quickly. "I have an appointment with Mr. Davis." He gestured to the lawyer seated at a corner table surrounded by papers. The hostess nodded, visibly relieved she wouldn't have to navigate this awkward situation. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery." Alexander made his way to the table where Davis, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s, stood to greet him. "Mr. Montgomery, I wasn't sure you'd come." "I said I would," Alexander replied simply, taking a seat. "Do you have the buyout offer?" Davis handed him a folder containing the formal proposal. Alexander opened it, skimmed the key points, then closed it again. "I have a counter-offer," he said, placing his own envelope on the table. Davis opened it, his professional neutrality slipping as he read the document inside. "This is unexpected, but legally binding," Alexander assured him. "All the paperwork is in order." "Ms. Johnson will want to review this herself," Davis cautioned. "Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise." Their business concluded, Alexander rose to leave, conscious that the longer he stayed, the more likely he was to encounter Zora unprepared. But as he turned toward the exit, he found his path blocked. "What are you doing here?" Zora asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm in her eyes. Seeing her up close after 2 weeks apart was like a physical blow. Alexander had rehearsed what he might say if they met, but now, faced with her direct gaze, the words evaporated. "I had an appointment with Mr. Davis," he managed finally, gesturing toward the lawyer, who was studying Alexander's documents with fascination. "Regarding the buyout?" Zora pressed. "Yes." She glanced at Davis, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Step into the office," she said to Alexander. "We should talk privately." The small office held memories of their last conversation, the moment her world had shattered. Alexander remained standing, giving Zora space as she closed the door behind them. "I understand you're trying to buy me out," he began. "Yes," Zora confirmed, her expression guarded. "Mama Esther's nephew is—" "I'm not selling," Alexander interrupted. "At least not under the terms you're offering." Anger flashed across Zora's face. "You can't just—" "I'm giving you my half of the restaurant," Alexander said quickly, before she could build up steam. "No strings, no conditions, no payment required. I've signed all the necessary paperwork. Davis has it." Zora stared at him, disbelief replacing anger. "What? Soul and Table is yours, Zora. It always should have been. I'm just making that official." She shook her head, processing his words. "Why would you do that? It's worth millions." "Because it's the right thing to do," Alexander said simply. "Because I hurt you deeply, and I can't undo that. But I can ensure that the dream we built together remains yours, untainted by my presence or the circumstances that brought us together." Zora's composure wavered for the first time. "I don't understand you, Alexander, any of this." "I know," he acknowledged. and I don't expect forgiveness or a second chance. I just want you to have what you deserve, what you worked so hard to create." He moved toward the door, but Zora's next words stopped him. "The 10 million, she said. "What happened with that?" Alexander turned back. "I paid Victor, told him I lost the bet." "But you didn't," Zora pointed out, a hint of her analytical mind showing through her emotional armor. "I did say what I said. You won by the terms." "Not really," Alexander replied quietly. "The bet required you to say it and mean it. Given what happened, I think we can agree the second part wasn't fulfilled." Zora was silent for a long moment, studying him with those perceptive amber eyes that had seen through his facade from the beginning. "I did mean it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what makes this so hard. I meant every word." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected. "I meant it too," Alexander replied, equally quiet. "I still do." Zora looked away, blinking rapidly. "That doesn't change what happened." "No," Alexander agreed. "It doesn't." He gathered his courage for what he needed to say next. "Zora, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but if you ever decide you might be willing to hear the whole story, to understand how things changed for me, I'll be waiting." He placed a business card on her desk, not his usual embossed corporate card, but a simple one with just his personal number. "No pressure," he added. "If I never hear from you again, I'll understand. Either way, Soul and Table is yours. I've also established a foundation to help fund the community programs we planned, the culinary school, the job training, all of it. It's in your name, completely separate from me. Davis has those details too." Zora looked from the card to his face, emotions warring in her expression. "You really have changed, haven't you?" "Because of you," Alexander said. "Whether we have a future or not, I'll always be grateful for that." With nothing left to say, he turned to leave, but Zora's voice stopped him again, just as his hand touched the doorknob. "Alexander." He looked back. "I'm not promising anything," she cautioned, "but I might call, someday, when I'm ready." It was more than he'd dared hope for, a tiny crack in a door he'd thought permanently closed. "I'll be here," he promised, "however long it takes." Outside the restaurant, Alexander paused on the sidewalk, allowing himself a moment to absorb what had just happened. He'd gone in expecting nothing, prepared to walk away with the knowledge that he'd at least tried to make amends. Instead, he'd been given the faintest glimmer of possibility. It might come to nothing. Zora might never call. The damage he'd done might prove irreparable. But for the first time since the truth had come out, Alexander felt something like hope. As he walked down the street, away from Soul and Table and the woman who had changed his life, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. A callous bet made on a night when he'd been at his most arrogant and least authentic had led him to the most genuine relationship he'd ever known. He'd lost a fortune twice over, the 10 million to Victor and his half of the restaurant to Zora, but he'd gained something far more valuable: perspective, purpose, and the knowledge of what real love felt like, however briefly he'd experienced it. If Zora never called, he would continue becoming the better man she'd glimpsed in him. If she did, well, then he'd have the chance to prove that man wasn't just a glimpse, but a reality. Either way, Alexander Montgomery was no longer the person who had walked into the elite all those months ago, looking at a waitress and seeing only a bet to be won. That man was gone, transformed by love and loss and the painful wisdom that comes from both. The $10 million bet had cost him everything, and it had been worth every penny. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.